Xbox's legacy contains some of the biggest games from the last 2 decades, the first successes of online console gaming, and some truly revolutionary hardware. But right now in 2024, Microsoft's gaming division is in a strange place, and there's arguably been more questions than ever about the future of the brand. As such, it's an appropriate time to look back on their history, starting from the humble beginnings of the first giant green and black X of the original Xbox to today, and picking out the best Xbox title of every year. In the name of fairness, this list will only consider exclusives, including timed or staggered releases, or in some cases console exclusives where a game that was also released simultaneously for Windows. So with that said, I'm Sai for WhatCulture.com, and here is the best Xbox game of every year from 2001 to 2024. 2001, Halo Combat Evolved. With the original Xbox launching in November 2001, there's a fairly small roster of games to pick from. That said, the choice is clear. Development of Halo Combat Evolved was a tumultuous road, starting in 1997 as a Mac computer real-time strategy title in its earliest form. Through the years, Halo would transform into a first-person shooter that led players through a deep spacefaring narrative. The first installment introduced the world to the legendary figure of Master Chief, the face of not just the Halo series but the Xbox brand. Even today, when the franchise is in a less healthy place, Spartan 117 is still synonymous with the big green X. Microsoft needed a big system seller, and Halo got the world talking instantly. There was something completely addictive about the gameplay loop, the thrill of fighting down waves of aliens with a roster of incredibly satisfying weaponry, not to mention vehicular combat, across some massive maps. It pioneered in a great many places, and where it wasn't the first, it was quite simply the most refined, breaking open the floodgates for console FPS experiences. It's appropriate to kick this list off with almost unquestionably the most important game in the history of Xbox. It's not too bold a claim that its success allowed Microsoft to take the foothold they needed to enter the console gaming market. 2002, Tom Clancy's Splinter Cell. Around the late 90s, Ubisoft began using the Tom Clancy branding on several military-focused shooters. The first was Rainbow Six, based on an actual Clancy book, then came Ghost Recon, and in 2002, Splinter Cell arrived. The first game released from the Ubisoft Montreal studio, Splinter Cell was described by audiences as a hyper-real Metal Gear Solid, which was exactly the point. Developers sought an answer to the upcoming PS2 eventual mega hit MGS2, and in so doing kicked off their very own franchise. Sam Fisher's premiere mission broke new ground with the jaw-dropping lighting system which sat at the core of the concept. Now it wasn't simply about evading an enemy's line of sight, but directly interacting with it by taking out light and then navigating through the darkness with night vision goggles. Players used light and shadow to their advantage, carefully tracking the amount of sound they were making and flicking to the heat-sensitive visor to keep an eye on enemies. Splinter Cell opened the door to brand new levels of immersive digital worlds and won a bevy of awards for its efforts. And yes, the game did eventually come to the PS2 and GameCube, but for the first 5 or so months it was a tantalizing Xbox exclusive that made early adopters of Microsoft's system glad they were in on the ground floor. 2003, Star Wars Knights of the Old Republic. It's one thing to press a button and swing an electronic lightsaber, and it's a whole other to step into the galaxy far, far away and live it. This is what made 2003 Star Wars Knights of the Old Republic as special as it was. KOTOR, as it's come to be known, is revered for a good number of things. It's one of the games that really put BioWare on the map before they started work on their own IPs. It innovated on character customization for the genre, offering various classes and the chance to fight on either the light side or dark side of the Force. More than this, alongside Elder Scrolls 3, it was one of the first truly massive feeling Western RPGs to land on a console, as the Xbox version predated the game's release on PC, showing that console gaming could rival computers. KOTOR sold out in 4 days thanks to hungry Star Wars fans that were inspired by rave reviews about its story, writing, and fully voiced characters. If you enjoyed the recently released prequel themes, this game felt like an epic continuation, and if you disliked them, KOTOR's deep narrative was the salve for your wounds. Knights of the Old Republic is still heralded by many Star Wars fans as one of the most engaging tales in the universe over 20 years later. 2004, Ninja Gaiden. Ninja Gaiden might have felt like an odd choice perhaps for a revived franchise of the 1990s, but this timed exclusive for Xbox was one of the surprise hits of 2004. After Ryu Hayabusa had joined the ranks of Dead or Alive during a dormant period of his own series, this year finally saw him take centre stage again. With the character being recognised by worldwide Dead or Alive players, Tecmo and Team Ninja designed the new Ninja Gaiden with Western audiences in mind, appropriately so, as while sales in Japan were low, as was the Xbox install base, it was a huge hit in the US and Europe. Upon release, Ninja Gaiden became synonymous with rewarding challenge. In a world between the era of NES hard and the Soulsborne influence on today's industry, Ryu's return was seen as a test of gaming mettle in the mid-2000s. The game didn't let up from start to finish, and in particular its pace and level design were singled out by critics as strong points. Ninja Gaiden also had some incredible creature design brilliantly realised in a way that showed the technical capabilities of the hardware available. Whilst the franchise has since turned quiet, for a while Ninja Gaiden was a series that PlayStation fans envied. 2005, Forza Motorsport. Since 1997, Gran Turismo had been the last word in racing sims. Many had tried and failed to topple PlayStation and Polyphony Digital's Titan franchise, but hadn't ever really come close to the same reaction or staying power. With every new iteration, Gran Turismo pushed the genre ahead to craft the most complete racing experience. Forza Motorsport's developers directly set out to be the next competitor to the throne, and considering both its consistency and brand value in the decades since, it's fair to say that they succeeded. What truly set Forza a step ahead of its contemporaries was car customization. Greatly expanding what the Gran Turismo series had done before, players could now swap an engine out of one machine into another and experience relatively realistic results. More than this, the game allowed for 100 layers of cosmetic customization, giving racers a chance to decorate their many vehicles with very authored designs and then take them online with Xbox Live. Despite the Xbox 360 launching in late 2005, the most important Microsoft exclusive of the year without question is Forza Motorsport on the original Xbox. 2006, Dead Rising. The first year of the Xbox 360 was stacked. The original Gears of War, Oblivion, Rainbow Six Vegas, all of these games were not just fantastic experiences, but pushed the industry forward. However, there was none so unique as Dead Rising. Whilst Capcom had plenty of experience already with zombies thanks to Resident Evil, this brand new IP allowed for a totally different take and feel. Instead of dark, cramped corridors where players fought tooth and nail against a couple of terrifying undead, Dead Rising put hundreds of zombies into the open space of a brightly lit mall. It then thrust traffic cones and guitars and shopping trolleys into players' hands and basically said, go nuts. Being designed specifically for the next generation did create issues with tiny on-screen text for players with standard definition TVs, but if anything it just felt as though the future had arrived. Seeing so many enemies swarming photojournalist Frank West was mind-blowing, as was mowing them down in a sedan. Dead Rising was one of the biggest flag wavers for what the Xbox 360 was capable of and sold over 1 million copies. 2007, Halo 3. The original Halo had helped Microsoft establish themselves as a real competitor in the console gaming space. As such, each subsequent release was given appropriate pomp and circumstance, becoming the biggest launch event in the industry at the time. Halo 3's in particular was special. The Finish the Fight marketing for Halo was huge and incredibly powerful, and helped to make the game feel like a real moment in entertainment history. As the capstone of the original trilogy, Halo 3 rewarded loyal players of the franchise by providing an epic conclusion to the story of Master Chief, Cortana, the Covenant, and the Halo rings. Delivering perhaps the most exciting and emotionally rewarding campaign of the franchise, Bungie managed to somehow meet all expectations. And then when players picked themselves back up after the incredible story, they also had one of the deepest and most accomplished online components in FPS history still ahead of them. Alongside new maps, weapons and vehicles, what made Halo 3 so special was its community and how Bungie utilised it. Thanks to the Forge mode, which allowed Halo's huge fanbase to create custom content, the game evolved slowly over time as it wholeheartedly embraced popular custom maps and game types. This not only helped it stay at the top of the mountain of incredible Xbox 360 releases throughout the console's lifespan, it also set a precedent for other online games to follow. 2008, Gears of War 2. As close to perfect as the original Gears of War was, Gears 2 managed to at least match, if not exceed, its forebear. No better is this evidenced by Gears 2's Metacritic score sitting 1 point below the original game for critics, but 1 point higher for the fans. Gears 2 once again walked the line between over-the-top meathead monster blasting violence and a touching turbulent story of human survival. Whilst on the outside the game promised bravado and brutality, its superb writing and lead performances made it a testament to the cinematic scope of gaming at the time. Sure, Halo may have been Xbox's right hand, but Gears was often just as big or bigger. Perfectly demonstrating this on its opening weekend, Gears 2 set the record for the highest simultaneous player count on Xbox Live by breaking the 1 million player threshold. Reason for this being that Gears of War 2's online component was a massive step up from the first, featuring an innovative matchmaking system and a broader selection of modes. One of these, of course, was Horde. When the market was chock-a-block with PvP shooters, Gears 2 tested the camaraderie and teamwork of friends against waves of enemies in a mode that altogether defined the best that the series had to offer. 2009 Left 4 Dead 2. Like the original, Left 4 Dead 2 was a console exclusive for the Xbox 360, which allowed owners of the machine to gloat that the system could do some of the more complex computing that was more synonymous with PC gaming. And also, like the original, Left 4 Dead 2 was entering a gaming space that was overstuffed with zombie-themed survival games. However, no one did it quite like Valve and Turtle Rock. Simple mechanics, incredible sound design, and a player-to-enemy balance that meant that teamwork was a must if you wanted to survive. On its surface, the game was more of what you love. New maps, new characters, new weapons, new special zombie types, but the game in general was a tighter and broader package than its predecessor. In particular, the AI director under the hood of the original game received a major overhaul. Now, not only were repeat playthroughs altered by enemy and weapon spawns, but the locations themselves could change slightly every time, with tweaks to weather, lighting, and even layout. As such, Left 4 Dead 2, even 15 years later, still gets around 20,000 players a month, going to show that it's never been bested when it comes to group PvE zombie slaying chaos. 2010 Mass Effect 2. At the time, Mass Effect 2 was seen as a huge improvement over its original, already impressive sibling. In the years that followed, it's been largely deemed as the best entry in the franchise, if not the entire genre. Unlike Mass Effect 3, it had a satisfying climax where your decisions as Commander Shepard had a long-term effect, and unlike Mass Effect 1, it didn't have awful driving controls. In all seriousness, BioWare's spacefaring sequel made the most of being the middle part of the adventure. With the overarching story already set up, Mass Effect 2 could instead shift its focus to building character interactions and then fold these back into the game's universe. Players connected with Mass Effect 2 on both macro and micro levels all at once, as each NPC side story explored who they were whilst also fleshing out their species and their alliances and struggles therein. It also didn't hurt that the combat felt so much better and that the UI was so smooth. The game received universal acclaim on release, being nominated for and winning a slew of awards including Best Xbox 360 Game, Best RPG, and Game of the Year. Mass Effect 2 remains a beautiful experience both aesthetically speaking and on a more touching human level as you and the relationships you forged march into the great unknown together. 2011 Gears of War 3. With the time that development now takes in today's age, getting a complete trilogy released on a single system is a pretty unlikely affair. However, if one franchise were to perfectly embody the lifespan of the Xbox 360 from every possible perspective, it would be Gears of War. As such, it's fitting that Gears of War 3 was the best Xbox game released in 2011. Whilst the campaign of Gears of War 2 tends to be the overall fan favourite, the crescendo of the Marcus Phoenix trilogy has some of the most gut-punching and air-punching moments in the entire series, all set to some stunning visuals and cinematography. Like its predecessor, Gears 3 was no slouch on the multiplayer side of things either. The potential of Horde mode was cracked wide open, building on what came before by giving players fortifications against the oncoming enemy waves, and for the first time, the campaign supported 4-player co-op. Perhaps the most underrated element of Gears 3 though was its challenges and rewards. Sure, it asked players to put in some serious work to unlock its cosmetics, but it tracked progress across every single mode, making sure that players who came for one thing at least tried out the wealth of content in the conclusion of the original trilogy. 2012 Forza Horizon. With every Xbox showcase that rolls around, players not engaged in driving games will inevitably roll their eyes at the amount of time given to the Forza franchise. But with it crossing the $1 billion mark in 2017, it's no surprise that Microsoft has leaned so heavily on it over the years. And Forza Horizon was a big part of the franchise's continued success, crafting a series in its own right by taking drivers off the speedway and out into the hills of Colorado. Whilst open world driving wasn't new, it hadn't been approached with the same degree of attention that the Forza brand demanded. Allowing racers to navigate mountain paths, winding foothills, and the open road made for a totally completely different experience, which was all the sweeter thanks to Forza's trademark tightness in controls and depth of content. This total shake-up of style, with finish lines for races now being randomly generated and new game types like cat and mouse, was particularly welcomed by the online community. Horizon's more open-ended vibe allowed for an entry point to those who were daunted by the intensity of motorsport and simply wanted to bomb around a beautiful rendering of the American countryside in over 200 potential vehicles. 2013, Dead Rising 3. The Xbox One era was a truly troubling time for Microsoft. The following entries may well reflect that, as Xbox started to move away from exclusive releases and tried to bill itself as the hub of entertainment in the home. And did nobody tell them that they could actually do both? And that's not to say that some games around this time don't deserve their praise, and there's a lot to like about Capcom's Dead Rising 3, but if a solid 7 out of 10 is your best exclusive game of the year, then that's very telling. And whilst Dead Rising 3 was far from the prettiest princess at the next-gen ball, it found appropriately familiar ways to impress. The seamless, significantly bigger map than the first two games was populated with hordes of the undead and was the perfect staging area for mayhem. The refinement of the controls therefore goes a long way to making exploration and zombie killing sprees a breeze, be that on foot or in one of the game's many new combo vehicles. Dead Rising is all about massive, mindless destruction, and this was multiplied tenfold for every additional player added to the same map via the game's co-op mode. Despite being hampered by lackluster writing and tonal whiplash, Dead Rising 3 was at least a solid start to the Xbox One, even if it wasn't the system seller that a new console so desperately needs. 2014, Sunset Overdrive. With the number of exclusives in its first year being so painfully low and Microsoft fumbling the launch in other ways such as the DRM controversy, it's meant that the hidden gems on Xbox One were truly hidden. That is to say that Sunset Overdrive is an overlooked cult classic that deserved so much better. Whereas post-apocalyptic was already in danger of becoming a tired phrase, Insomniac Games christened Sunset Overdrive an awesome apocalypse. A bombastic, frenetic, stylish affair where players glide, grind and skate around a colourful city, blasting robots and energy drink-fueled zombies with weapons such as guitars, firework guns and bowling ball launchers. It felt like a Saturday morning cartoon in the best possible way. And truly, Sunset Overdrive might be Insomniac's secret magnum opus. The ridiculous arsenal was akin to their Ratchet & Clank series, combined with the real sense of momentum that the studio's eventual PlayStation Spider-Man series would be acclaimed for. But all contained within a wonderfully cartoonish setting, complete with comic book-like text appearing alongside some of your actions. Insomniac Games might be one of the most reliable development studios of the modern era, which is precisely why they've been given the keys to the Marvel Kingdom under the ownership of Sony. That said, Sunset Overdrive accomplishes perhaps that little bit more by being so brash, charmingly stupid, and refreshingly original. 2015 Rare Replay. Several years before the launch of Game Pass, 2015's Rare Replay, intentionally or otherwise, made for a strong rebuttal against the talk that Xbox didn't have a solid portfolio. Or moreover, Microsoft's acquisition of Rare gave them a solid portfolio by proxy. Celebrating 30 years of the company with 30 of their best titles, the quality and artistry on display was inarguable. The package featured Viva Pinata, Blast Corps, as well as the remastered versions of Perfect Dark and the Banjo-Kazooie games, plus a slew of early ZX Spectrum outings. It's arguably cheating to feature a collection of classics, but Rare Replay was so much more than that. Everything was tied together with the attention to detail that one expects from Rare, with a charming UI and unlockable documentary pieces on the company's history. And whilst Rare Replay wasn't a brand new game, it did feature the console debut of the Battletoads arcade sequel. This was the extra cherry on top of the video game preservation sundae. When many classic games are getting harder to get a hold of, Rare put 30 of their best in one place for a mere $30. And despite criticisms that it wasn't totally comprehensive thanks to various copyright issues from Nintendo, Rare Replay was still well worth its below average asking price, and even more so in later years when GoldenEye was eventually gifted to owners for free. 2016 Quantum Break. There's some irony perhaps in that the Xbox One's infamous E3 unveiling and its obsession with TV did coincide with one of the better exclusives of 2016 being a hybrid piece of media. Quantum Break was Remedy Entertainment's first console game since 2010's Alan Wake, and is perhaps even more of a cult classic than that had been. Between missions of Quantum Break, players were invited to sit back and enjoy an episode of a serialized serialized live-action drama that took place alongside their own actions. Even if the reception to the show itself was varied, the concept was intriguing. Performances from lead actors such as Aidan Gillen and the late great Lance Reddick were the glue between the two halves. From a gameplay standpoint, where Quantum Break perhaps didn't always land as a shooter was more than made up by the player's time-based powers, freezing enemies, dashing to and from cover, and using time itself as a shield, all of which can be comboed into each other for some seriously rewarding and incredible looking combat sequences. Where it truly excelled was its environmental design and the way that players used those powers to navigate and solve puzzles. Whilst Quantum Break never became the huge IP that Microsoft had perhaps hoped for, it exceeded sales expectations and became the console's best seller up to that point. 2017, Cuphead. Few new IPs get quite a strong a reaction as Cuphead did in 2014 when it was shown very briefly at E3 that year as part of a sizzle reel. Over time, the run and gunner inspired by the golden age of animation grew a significant level of interest because there was nothing out there on the market like it. As such, it made a splash when it landed and in fact delivered, becoming the most enviable Xbox game that year and perhaps across the lifespan of the Xbox One. In a time where hunger for challenging games was rising, Cuphead offered something different from the dark and brooding Soulsborne games and their many copycats by harkening back to games of the past. And best of all, it did so in a beautiful, bizarre and consistent art style that only the current generation could handle. Even when Cuphead was smashing players from pillar to post, which was all of the time really, it was a delight for the eyes. Cuphead fever was truly massive, spawning a Netflix show, a tabletop game, and even getting some unexpected representation in the video game historical encyclopedia that was Nintendo's Super Smash Bros. Ultimate. 2018, Sea of Thieves. With heads of the Xbox brand laser focused on building the value of Game Pass as a one-stop shop since its release in June 2017, Xbox's roster of 2018 exclusives was almost non-existent. Crackdown 3, State of Decay 2 and even Sea of Thieves all launched to tepid results. However, over time, the clear winner of that trio has not only risen up as one of the best Xbox games, but also one of the best games that year period, and also a shining example of live service done right. Sea of Thieves' biggest draws have always been its social aspects and freedom, allowing teams of players to board their custom ships and follow their hearts. There's treasure to be found, other pirates to battle, and monsters in the deep to flee from. Each moment of tension, panic, and loss makes every shared success at discovery or victory that much sweeter. It's Rare's commitment to quality that turned the game around, even going so far as to secure license deals with Secret of Monkey Island and Pirates of the Caribbean for beefy stories that fit so joyfully into the tapestry of the Devil's Shroud. Sea of Thieves launched as a very pretty game with that distinctive Rare charm, but nothing beyond the surface. In one of gaming's greatest redemption arcs, it slowly became one of the most rewarding online games still active today, proving its worth to the 30,000 players it still retains 6 years later. 2019, Gears 5. In 2016, the Coalition, a development studio handpicked by Microsoft to take the reins from Epic Games, put out their first new story in the Gears of War saga. Even with a new cast of characters, a new threat, and a significant time jump, Gears of War 4 was criticised as playing things too safe. Reacting to this is where Gears 5's true strengths lay. New robotic companion Jack could be upgraded to change the flow of battle. The game featured optional larger open areas that, whilst poorly marketed as open world, made for a refreshing change of pace and allowed players to pause the flow of the story to explore the world a little more. Overall, the level and encounter design are up there as some of the best in the series, and the game was superbly well written, offering an intriguingly more human drive to the Gears universe. Unfortunately, the game was severely let down on launch by an extremely thin multiplayer portion. Gears 5's multiple awards of Best Xbox Game at the time felt more like the circumstance of it yet again being one of the very few exclusives released in 2019 for the Green brand. That said, like Sea of Thieves, time and updates were kind to Gears 5 in turning it around to something that felt more worthy. 2020, Ori and the Will of the Wisps. 2020's long-awaited Ori and the Will of the Wisps was the perfect example of what a sequel can and should do. Instead of being a very pretty homage to the genre like the first game was, Will of the Wisps expanded its influence to include more contemporary titles, unlocking the franchise's full potential. With a larger map, there was adequate space space for the studio to expand the scope of what an Ori game could be. A selection of well-realised NPCs fleshed out the new location of Newen, almost all of whom served purposes like tracking stats or offering side quests. Boss battles entered the fray for the first time, giving the pace of the game a more precise flow. In turn, these gelled perfectly with Ori's new blade and projectile-based offense, which overhauled the combat into something ultimately more satisfying. It would be impossible to talk about Ori without complimenting its art direction, and Will of the Wisps was gorgeous in every regard. A brilliant soundtrack, jaw-dropping visuals, and some captivating animation. There was something indelibly warm and sincere about the game's presentation and touching story beats. Both Ori titles are a testament to games as art, but it's easy to argue that Will of the Wisps remains the most compelling feeling Metroidvania still today. 2021 Forza Horizon 5. Realistically speaking, Microsoft had two exclusives launch in 2021. One of these was Halo Infinite, which, whilst it can be argued as a great total package now, wasn't exactly warmly received at the time. The other was Forza Horizon 5, which, in a series which regularly scores extremely well on Metacritic, became one of the highest praised entries in Xbox's most consistent franchise and opened up to 10 million players in its first week. Forza Horizon 5 was all about refining an idea to its sharpest point. It was the so far logical endpoint for a side series that took Forza's racing sim mechanics and put them in a more arcadey setting. You couldn't drive more than a few minutes across the game's huge map without encountering some sort of objective, ranging from off-road races to finding rare cars in barns, from drift challenges to wreckage events that see players destroying pinatas. Everything was optional and brilliantly all equally viable as players consistently earned adventure points towards their completion and the rewards of new vehicles from the game's absurd collection of over 800 came thick and fast. Forza Horizon 5 was more about freedom than ever. This also included the freedom to ignore it all and simply enjoy the game's refined driving mechanics while exploring one of the prettiest open worlds released this generation. 2022 Grounded. Grounded was exciting right from the off. Developed by reliable RPG hands Obsidian Entertainment, the game entered early access in 2020 with a campaign that was about 20% complete. In the 2 years between this and the full release, the company were praised for using feedback from their audience to shape the game, which at one stage, while still in early access, got to a whopping player base of 5 million. The result of this was the best Xbox game in 2022, a Honey, I Shrunk the Kids inspired adventure where players are reduced to the size of an ant, dropped in a backyard which now feels like a jungle, and tasked with protecting themselves from terrifying insects, crafting themselves into a formidable survivalist, and trying to escape. Aside from its brilliantly realised setting, this was what made Grounded great. It was a rare survival game that had an end goal. Rather than just crafting more and more until you were unstoppable, players knew that their ultimate destination was to finish the story and leave the backyard for good. This really helped drive both solo players and groups forward rather than drop off early, all assisted by an addictive gameplay loop which was expertly paced with meaty quests and satisfying character growth. In a genre swimming with some pretty half-assed attempts to cash in on the survival craze, Grounded proved that good things can come in small packages. 2023 Hi-Fi Rush. 2023 wasn't without its issues for the Green brand, but it also had plenty of wins. For the company, their acquisition of Activision Blizzard was finally a done deal. For gamers, Xbox delivered console exclusives like Cocoon, Lies of P, and Starfield. Whilst the last of those was perhaps the biggest and most anticipated launch of the year for the console, it was met with very mixed reactions. On the other hand, Hi-Fi Rush felt like a unifying moment. The slick, stylish action game Shadow dropped in January, kicking off 2023 with smiles amongst Game Pass owners who had immediate access to Tango Gameworks' latest accomplishment. And an accomplishment it was, as Hi-Fi Rush's sense of humour, breezy pacing, and chaotic gameplay cuts through the usual modern gaming fare with aplomb. The rhythm-based combat was entirely addictive and paired wonderfully with the game's colourful world, which animated perfectly in time to the beat to create a setting that was simply satisfying to be in. Appropriately, Hi-Fi Rush's audio design and soundtrack went on to win awards at the end of the year, proving it left a mark throughout all of 2023. With the sad closure of Tango in the following year, it's a sting in the narrative to know that Hi-Fi Rush will not get the sequel that it no doubt deserves. And finally, 2024 Hellblade 2 Senua's Sacrifice. And thus we come to the current year as of recording. Whilst 2024 is only half over, it's been a very bad year for Microsoft. Aside from the ill will associated with the heartless closures of smaller studios, such as the aforementioned Tango Gameworks, it's also just been a very quiet year for games. I mean, Hellblade 2 wins purely by default by being the only Xbox console exclusive to launch so far. In its defense, Senua's Sacrifice did grab a strong Metacritic of 81 on release, with an audience reaction sitting at a sturdy 7.1. The game has been praised for its gorgeous graphics, stunning location design, and the continued immersive storytelling of Senua's Psychosis from the first game. But it was also criticised for not shaking things up enough. Whilst the devs clearly spent more time on combat-related animations, and they do look great, the game lacks depth in terms of approaching the combat itself. One's perspective and expectation is everything with Hellblade 2. Microsoft's marketing of the game implied it was closer to AAA fare than Ninja Theory perhaps intended. If the goal was to craft a solid narrative-driven puzzle adventure like the first game, then the developers have certainly succeeded. It's impossible to say where Hellblade 2 will find itself for Xbox when awards season rolls around, and it seems like a great example of the doubt and mistrust that the Xbox brand continues to unfortunately generate in 2024. When Sony first entered the console space with the PlayStation, they immediately made space for themselves and their weird grey box. Since then, PlayStation has survived long enough to see Sega fall, Microsoft rise, and through ups and downs of their own, be recognised as the most popular video game system of choice around the world. But the question remains, across 3 decades of PlayStation, which games are the cream of the crop? Which titles defined Sony systems year on year? And whilst there are 31 games here to talk about, remember that it's not the top 31 PlayStation games ever. Some years were just stuffed with classics, and choosing just one was a real Sophie's choice. There's absolutely no way to please everyone. Sorry, Crash fans. No! Like our Xbox list of the same style, this video will only take into account console exclusives, including timed or staggered releases, and in some early cases, games that headed exclusively to the PlayStation from the arcade. So, I'm Sai, this is What Culture, and these are the best PlayStation games every year from 1994 to 2024. 1994, Ridge Racer. With the original PlayStation launching on December 3rd, 1994 in Japan, there's really only a handful of games to pick from. The console's launch lineup was a pretty underwhelming bag, save for a couple of titles, but it's Namco's Ridge Racer that's easily the most memorable. And not just because that time Kaz Hirai went, Ridge Racer! Remember that? Of course, the PlayStation launched 2 years ahead of the Nintendo 64 and managed to get out in front of the Sega Saturn sales-wise with a more competitive price tag. Ridge Racer felt like it was dragged and dropped from the arcade into the home in a way that seemed impossible back in 1994. The minor concessions of frame rate and less background detail didn't matter when players could jump into such a fast, gratifying 3D title. But more than just being a solid port, Ridge Racer was a triumph of design and is recognised as the first game to use 3D texture mapping. It was a pretty small package, lacking any multiplayer mode and not much in the way of a difficulty curve, but as a statement of intent, Ridge Racer was a worthy addition to Sony's launch lineup. It was a declaration that the PlayStation was laying down the road to the future and then drifting along it in style. 1995, Tekken. Whilst Tekken isn't the first 3D fighter, it's easily the game of its era that made the biggest waves. Most importantly, Namco got the concept into living rooms whilst it was fresh. Yes, Virtua Fighter was the first widespread 3D fighter in arcades, but its Sega Saturn port was overshadowed by Tekken's arrival on the PlayStation 6 months later. Namco and Sony's partnership had done the same for fighting that it had previously done for racing. Tekken didn't merely blow the fighting genre outwards into a new dimension, it built itself around the new opportunities that this afforded. The concept of the game was intuitive and inventive, mapping a limb to each of the 4 face buttons. There were no special moves, instead players had to largely rely on their ability to weave attacks together. Tekken also used the jump to 3D gaming to move storytelling in fighting games forward, with each character having their own arcade mode ending cinematic. By today's standards, they're frankly hilarious. My favourites are this guy having a bad acid trip while Yoshimitsu throws money at him, and King being the teacher of a school that crosses the boundary between the video game world and this one. In general, as with many early 3D 3D games, it looks quaint now, but at the time it was jaw-dropping to have access to a game that looked and moved like this at home. Tekken was the first PlayStation game to sell 1 million units, and it was surely a contributing factor for many people to buy the system in the first place. 1996, Resident Evil. It's very illuminating to stack up some of the best of what the PlayStation had to offer and look at where it is today. Not only did the system kick off franchises that are still huge, it also popularized entire genres. Horror games hadn't really been achievable until the 90s, and Resident Evil was the one that blew the doors off of that particularly spooky mansion. For all of its cheesy dialogue and that utterly bonkers live-action opening, it was a testament to the tight building blocks of Resident Evil that it remained scary. The game fully utilized its fixed cameras to put danger around the corner, and a limited inventory meant that players must think and flee rather than loot and shoot. More than just horror, what the original Resident Evil still does better than most games of its series or genre is the puzzle box nature of everything. The almost Metroidvania-like exploration of the Spencer Mansion, matching each key to its retrospective mystery, was totally engaging and helped to grow the player's familiarity with the location and the awkward controls, which the game would then turn on its head by forcing them either out into new areas or to deal with new, far more threatening enemies. Whilst a worthy franchise span off from it, the original Resident Evil is still a complete experience that is rewarding to play, even if in 2024 you wonder how we ever found it scary. Except the bit where the dogs smash through the windows, that bit's always terrifying. 1997, Final Fantasy VII. Even over 25 years on, many people consider Final Fantasy a PlayStation franchise. Ironically, when it comes to mainline exclusivity, it really only lasted for 9 years. The reason this is worth pointing out is simply to illustrate how big the franchise became off the back of the golden era that began with 1997's Final Fantasy VII. Sony and Square's partnership was monumental for both parties, setting up the studio to create one of the most expensive games to that point. As a result, FF7 managed to not just feel huge, spanning across 3 discs, but also maintained an extremely high bar of quality for the time, as it flowed seamlessly from chibified overworld to high-quality battle models to nearly 45 minutes of full-motion video. The game's use of pre-rendered backgrounds brought to life the incredible art direction and world, allowing players to bathe in an often imitated, never bettered post-industrial cyberpunk setting, paired with one of Nobuo Uematsu's most daring soundtracks. The game was applauded for its character work and story, which dealt in some truly timeless themes like conservationism, death and rebirth, guilt and identity, and purpose. The gameplay was no slouch either, with the ingeniously simple materia system allowing players full customization of their party. Whilst Final Fantasy and RPGs had existed in the West long before, word of mouth made FF7 the entry point for so many and set a standard that Square and the rest of the industry, for better or worse, is still compared to this day. 1998, Metal Gear Solid. 1998 has long since been regarded as one of the best years in industry history. That said, even amongst other games from even those 12 months, Metal Gear Solid needs to take the gold for so many reasons. Kojima and Metal Gear Solid by extension had a vision and grabbed the potential of video games by the scruff of the neck and dragged them into a new age. Whilst games were now more able to reflect the influences they were taking from film, Metal Gear Solid was the first title to take things to truly cinematic levels. The soundtrack, fully voiced script, and deliberate focus on longer cutscenes crafted a story unlike anything else in the medium. As such, the game quickly became a cornerstone of the PlayStation's identity. Considering its competition wasn't fulfilling the same level of realism and writing, PlayStation was an attractive space for adult gamers who wanted experiences that were aimed at them. More than this, the game's freedom of choice in how players approached the tactical espionage action created water cooler moments where players could share how they overcame each individual challenge. The lasting impact of Metal Gear Solid is obviously huge, popularizing stealth in the mainstream and inspiring the likes of Splinter Cell, Hitman, and Assassin's Creed. MGS is routinely picked as the best title on the system and is still regarded as one of the most important games of all time. 1999, Spyro 2. From games directed at adults into the humble mascot platformer now, which is something Sony had droves of for a time. Where Nintendo and Sega were easily represented with Mario and Sonic, PlayStation had a strong list of candidates for star pupil. Spyro might be the more more underrated pick, which is a shame because his original trilogy is incredibly fun. As the world counted down to the new millennium and hoped to God that their electronics wouldn't fry, the second game slid out and became a low-key PS1 banger. Spyro 2 Ripto's Rage, or Gateway to Glimmer in the UK, took the headstrong start of the original game and did what any great sequel does. The collectibles were more meaningful, the gameplay had greater variety, and the levels were far more interesting. And most importantly, Spyro fit into these levels better. Gem collecting was snappier, the glide and the charge were both a little slower and a lot tighter, and ergo more useful. Perhaps one of the game's biggest strengths was its story and characterization, which wasn't something the genre tended to dwell on. Most 3D platformers had opening and closing cutscenes to bookend the experience. However, Spyro 2 had a healthy dose of in-engine cutscenes and conversational dialogue with NPCs. They were charming, full of cartoon hijinks and pretty effective character writing, which helped to round out the world and contributed to the game's Saturday morning TV tone. Spyro 2 is a forgotten example of fulfilling the promise of its predecessor, and it was one of the best platformers on the original PlayStation. 2000, Tony Hawk's Pro Skater 2. It's the new millennium, the era of invincible cell phones, wallet chains, and kids having strange desires to eat fruit-scented gel pens because they smelt so good. It was also when things were at an all-time high for the extreme. For example, the two best-selling PlayStation games in the year 2000 were Tony Hawk's Pro Skater and Tony Hawk's Pro Skater 2. Sure, Pro Skater 2 came very quickly after the first, but it successfully delivered on the excitement generated by its predecessor with a wealth of new content. There were new multiplayer modes, far more skaters to play as, and loads of secret areas to discover in the game's roster of memorable maps. It also might seem minor, but Pro Skater 2 was the first game to feature a surprising unlockable character in the form of Spider-Man, which would set a precedent for future games that became as much of a talking point as anything else. The real difference maker was the Creator Skater and Creator Park modes. Allowing gamers to contribute to the sandbox and then take themselves into those creations really took advantage of the medium's ability to make players feel like they were part of something, illuminating a path for many sports and non-sports games to come. And in fact, in the same way that Doom's mods had done in the 90s, Tony Hawk's Pro Skater probably inspired gamers to want to be developers. Your mileage may vary on which game in the series is the outright best, but the second Tony Hawk's came at the extreme sports fever pitch. 2001 Grand Theft Auto 3. And with our first PlayStation 2 title, we have the franchise that perhaps best defines the console, heck, it probably best defines the era. The unexpected leap of the GTA series from top-down action games into a sprawling 3D open city was unprecedented. For all of what one might have to say about the groups and people who opposed GTA, the outcry proved that gaming as a medium needed to be taken seriously. Rockstar's latest magnum opus was a huge jump in realism, and it wasn't just the graphics, it was how grounded everything felt. GTA 3 was like a contemporary gangster movie featuring recognizable Hollywood actors. And yet, at the same time, it was a totally insane playground of escapism, allowing players to explore a fictional take on New York in various vehicles, wielding numerous weapons, and causing mayhem. Since the formula has been reiterated constantly in the last 20 years, both by Rockstar and a ton of IPs trying to catch the slipstream, you would think that GTA 3 would be very bare bones by today's standards. However, the fact that it's still fun proves that it's the perfect scratch for a particular kind of itch. Both PS2 Grand Theft Auto sequels added character and depth in their own way, sharpening GTA's points to make it one of the biggest video game franchises in the world. All of this to say, it would have been very easy to have Vice City and San Andreas come out on top of their respective years later in this video. However, for the sake of variety, let's just take this moment to acknowledge how great they are, and then just agree to talk up some other classics instead. Cool? Cool. The fact of the matter remains, Grand Theft Auto 3 changed the entire landscape of gaming in a way that very few games ever do. 2002, Ratchet & Clank. With Insomniac Games' time with Spyro coming to an end, their next project had a chance to freshen up the 3D platformer space and capitalise on the zeitgeist of the early 20th century. Tastes were changing, their target audience had grown up, and it was time for a new hero and his tin can friend. Enter Ratchet & Clank, an argumentative duo forced to travel a sci-fi world together with a bonkers arsenal of weapons and gadgets. Where 3D platformers of the previous generation had been jumps and spins and not a lot else, Ratchet & Clank Clank smashed the genre into the third-person shooter, offering a selection of brilliant and sometimes bizarre weaponry. It encouraged players to experiment. There were no wrong choices, just whatever felt the most right. Amidst the pure chaos of the Rhino missile launcher and the Glove of Doom, players were treated to pure eye candy with the game's bustling world. Kerwin's futuristic metropolis, complete with flying traffic, was a real next-generation moment, made all the sweeter by how fun it was to navigate with Insomniac's unsurprisingly tight control scheme. And with more worlds to see, secrets to find, and weapons to wield, Ratchet & Clank brought the 3D platformer into the new millennium in a hail of thruster packs, rocket launchers, and 2000's sarcasm. 2003, Silent Hill 3. Silent Hill 3's inclusion is proof positive that not every game needs to be a revolution, and truly there's absolutely nothing wrong with it if you enjoy what the previous game provided. Unfortunately for Konami, the early 2000s were a transformative period in gaming, and tastes were changing. Survival horror's slower pace and often finicky controls were being left in the dust of the popularity of contemporary action games. As such, Silent Hill 3 is often forgotten amongst a genre that was losing ground. However, it deserves its flowers for everything it does right, which is everything. In the same way that Silent Hill 2 was stacked with metaphors and representations of the protagonist's psyche, Team Silent did so again with Silent Hill 3. With the series' first female playable character, this opened up a new world of anxieties that could be distorted through Silent Hill's lens. Pregnancy, objectification, and the potential for assault. Heather Mason's journey to claim her own identity was on the surface a follow-up to the story of the original game, but bubbling underneath touch on themes few video games ever had before. Where many games would interchangeably swap protagonists from male to female, Team Silent pulls focus on the very real fears of their teenage girl hero. This was all delivered via top-of-the-line presentation, with the scariest locations in the series and some of the most beautifully melancholic music and horrifying ambience. 2004, Metal Gear Solid 3 Snake Eater. Trust Hideo Kojima and his team to push the industry forward. Metal Gear Solid 2 set a benchmark that few games across the PS2's lifespan ever got close to touching, but one title that did manage to gracefully soar over that bar was, of course, the next mainline entry in the series. Whilst the industry was still playing catch-up with the last game, MGS3 upped the ante again. Metal Gear Solid 3 Snake Eater is one of the best-looking games to grace the PlayStation 2, and it's down to the team's attention to detail. Crawling through the undergrowth, clothes flapping in the wind, the numerous subtleties of the lighting system, MGS3 is consistently stunning. It also contained some of the best character models of the generation, obviously helping its grand storytelling and immersion. Snake Eater worked brilliantly as a standalone tale, but as a prequel added immeasurable depth to the overall canon. The performances were the stuff of legend, with a cast of characters as memorable or more so than the original MGS. Taking the series back into the past and out into the jungle made for some big changes that the team absolutely rose to. With no radar, Snake's approach to sneaking required more precision, asking players to carefully choose the best camouflage. Players more than ever needed to scavenge what they could, including wildlife for food and stamina, as well as healing specific injuries. There was a greater choice of camera control, deeper close-quarter combat mechanics, and enough minor gameplay touches to fill 3 other games. It was and remains to be a mind-boggling feat that such a lengthy, content-rich product could also be one of the biggest graphical powerhouses of the system. 2005, Shadow of the Colossus. Shadow of the Colossus did many things worth talking about, but first and foremost, it brought the "Are video games art?" discussion to a screeching halt. At this point, it was undeniable that Team Ico's open-world adventure game delivered artistry on every level. Its audio, sense of scale, atmosphere, and gameplay all tied together to craft a gut punch of a game. What's remarkable about Shadow of the Colossus was how anti-trend it was, yet still managed to catch mainstream attention. Where other titles bragged about their lengthy script, Colossus had almost no dialogue. Other games were competing for the busiest open world, but Colossus was empty to the point of generating an uncomfortable atmosphere. It helped, of course, that what inhabitants it did have was so impressively rendered that it basically compelled players to stop and gawk from a distance. What? Perhaps most importantly, other games rewarded you for kills, but Colossus's big twist was turning the player's willingness to blindly follow directions on them and using it to shame them for their violence. Shadow of the Colossus both trusted the player's intuition and subverted it by game's end. Team Ico's masterpiece earned multiple Game of the Year awards and plaudits for every facet of the total package. Whilst many games have aped its mechanic of climbing gigantic creatures, perhaps the best thing one can say about Shadow of the Colossus is that it still remains in a field of one. Even over 15 years later, other developers haven't even tried to swing for the king for fear of missing. 2006, Kingdom Hearts 2. Launching alongside Final Fantasy XII and Persona 3, 2006 ought to be remembered as a great year for RPGs. However, Kingdom Hearts 2 takes the gold because it proved that lightning could indeed strike twice. After all, the combination of Disney and Final Fantasy could have so easily been a cash grab. Instead, Kingdom Hearts 2 is the moment the series goes the opposite way completely. The game is denser, the combat customization is broader, and this is the moment that the plotline becomes less a line and more of a spirograph. It's something about hearts and doors and nobodies and Organization 13, and there's a bit where everybody thinks that Goofy's dead and it's all very dramatic. And yet, as ludicrous as it all was, it was so easy to be swept up in it because it was so undeniable how great each individual part was. The presentation was, of course, top-notch, with incredible music and voice performances pulling you along for the ride through a fantastic choice of Disney worlds, which was paced in a way that few overstayed their welcome. Perhaps most importantly, Square had really tightened the controls. Exploration was far less finicky, combat was so much more satisfying, and the dreadful gummy ship stages from the first game were finally enjoyable. Kingdom Hearts 2 was the maturation of the original in every way, turning gaming's strangest crossover event into a franchise in its own right. To this day, KH2 sits as the peak of the series and stands as a testament to crafting something worthy of the sum of the parts provided. We're nearly through 2 generations, only 3 more to go. I'm dying. 2007, God of War 2. The PS2 itself was the ultimate sequel to a great console in the original PlayStation, and coincidentally, it was home to a lot of great sequels, many of which we've already discussed. However, it seems appropriate to end this era with one last such game. God of War 2 followed on from the success of the 2005 Santa Monica Studios original by fulfilling its promise. Combat flowed better and was more versatile when there was far more enemy variety for Kratos to cleave through, platforming was tighter and more diverse, and the quick-time events were more forgiving, allowing players to actually enjoy the cutscenes rather than anxiously sit waiting for button prompts to come out of nowhere. But one of God of War 2's greatest strengths lies outside of just how good it feels to play, and that's with its pacing. It had less ill-desired choke points compared to the first game, but equally it knew when to pull back and let players breathe. In a game largely focused on intense combat, this was an impressive skill, and gave room to establish scenes, show the sense of scale, and put the artistry of the presentation on full display. And God of War 2 is nothing if not a tour de force of awesome spectacle, with plenty of location variety, stunning boss fights, and a well put together story of vengeance and fate. It was a delicious cap on many a player's time with the PlayStation 2 that showed the best it had to offer as the console's time came to a close. 2008, Metal Gear Solid 4, Guns of the Patriots. At this point, it's just easier to cut to the chase and ask the question, it's a new Metal Gear Solid, so how did this one revolutionize the industry? Well, I'll tell you. 1. Metal Gear Solid 4 pushed the series' gameplay forward. The automatic camo system where Snake could blend into whatever background the player put him on was jaw-dropping at the time, and the Solid Eyes threat ring alerted Snake to potential targets without holding the player's hand. Alternatively, for those who wanted to go in all guns blazing, the game made use of its War is Everywhere theme by making ammo easy to purchase and guns fun to upgrade. Number 2, MGS4 pushed the franchise's story into new territory, aging up Snake and having him reunite with most everyone in the cast in a bid to wrap up 10 years of history and what still feels like the send-off to the franchise even after the release of MGS5. It's easy to forgive the character arc of IBS sufferer Johnny and his exposed buttocks when that ending is so powerful. Number 3, MGS4 pushed the PS3 to its limits. The visual fidelity still looks solid today, which meant that in 2008 it was at the top of its class. This is good news since MGS4 was famously as cinematic as Kojima had gotten to this point, with most of the game being cutscenes rather than gameplay. It seems appropriate that the first PS3 title to grace this list is Metal Gear Solid 4. For one thing, it remained one of the most attractive console exclusives for the generation, and additionally it's a game that, at the time of speaking at least, is still locked to this specific system. Ergo, very few games define the PS3 era like MGS4. 2009, Uncharted 2 Among Thieves. If MGS4 is one of the games that defines the PS3, then Uncharted is no doubt the series. Naughty Dog's new leading man Nathan Drake became something of a mascot for the system. All 3 of the PS3 installments were critically lauded, but Uncharted 2 had that extra spark of magic, a transitional moment where you could feel the studio finding the franchise's identity. 2 of the 3 main elements of Uncharted's action movie gameplay, shooting galleries and exploration, rotated at the perfect pace, both with improvements over the original. Climbing now felt as fluid as it looked, whether at your own speed or as the world fell down around you, and the locational variety kept exploration interesting. There was a tremendous flow and pacing to the experience, punctuated by its biggest moments. And these were the final piece of the puzzle. The action set pieces are where Uncharted 2 really changed the game. Spectacles were not only visually stunning, but since the player largely retained control, summoned a remarkable sense of danger and immediacy. Climbing across a moving train and fighting enemies atop a convoy of jeeps felt like the next generation had arrived, and set a precedent for the series to go bigger every time. Not only was Among Thieves the standout of Drake's adventures on the PS3, it was one of the best single-player campaigns of the generation. 2010 Metal Gear Solid Peace Walker. The PSP is a really interesting bit of kit in PlayStation's history. Arguably, it didn't leave quite the level of impact that Sony seemed to be looking for, but it had several amazing games make their home on it. The best of the bunch was Metal Gear Solid Peace Walker, which, you guessed it, pushed the console to its absolute limits. It's almost like if Kojima can be trusted with anything, it's pushing boundaries and letting you play as shirtless men. Peace Walker made use of what set the hardware apart from its home console counterparts. For example, the PSP couldn't do the grand cinematics the series was typically known for, so instead the game brilliantly told a lot of its story via gorgeous comic book style cutscenes in the style of famed MGS art director Yoji Shinkawa. Peace Walker's campaign acted as an interquel between MGS3 and all other games in the series, with a deep story worthy of the Metal Gear moniker divided into manageable, portable chunks. Whilst these chunks only added up to a story that lasted a few hours, the real meat of the game was in its base building mode. This set the stage for MGS5's central mechanics, and lest we forget, allowed Hideo Kojima himself to sneak his way into Metal Gear canon. And even with these modes aside, there was also a wealth of multiplayer content. Peace Walker might be the best example of a PlayStation IP transitioning onto the handheld, as everything looked and felt right and offered a worthy contribution to the franchise. 2011, Little Big Planet 2. Little Big Planet, Sony and Media Molecule's Mario Maker before Mario Maker is a moment that feels both like yesterday and somehow also something lost to the sands of time. What was so wonderful about Little Big Planet on launch was the feeling that the developers were pretty much giving PlayStation fans the keys to the game and saying, "You drive," and had as little an idea what would happen as anyone. Watching it evolve with people's creativity, inspiring each other, leading to official crossover DLC drops and community picks from Media Molecule was incredibly exciting. And Little Big Planet 2 therefore launched with all that the developers had learned from the fans in mind and ripped the lid off of things. Major improvements included functions to score your levels yourself rather than select pre-made music, the ability to develop NPCs, and most importantly, the controllinator. This device made LBP way more than a platform game, as players could write rules for all kinds of objects, essentially turning it into a full-blown engine in itself. Low-key best of all was that all the original levels from Little Big Planet were backwards compatible with Little Big Planet 2. Remember backwards compatibility? Little Big Planet 2 didn't shy away from trusting players' desire and ability to learn and apply that knowledge. And if you weren't much of a creator, you were buying into an ecosystem that supplied endless awesome levels, crafted by people who were. 2012 Persona 4 Golden. Going by Metacritic scores, Persona 4 Golden is tied as one of the best games of 2012 alongside Mass Effect 3. Only one of those games was not just a PlayStation exclusive, but released for the ill-fated PS Vita. So the next time someone says that the system didn't have any games, you let them know that it had one of the highest rated titles of 2012. It just didn't really have much else. Persona 4's murder mystery story was strong, but the real star was building relationships. Its stellar localization was brought to life by a star-studded voice cast, most of which have gone on to be the big names in the industry today, who were able to make the most of each moment, be it cozy, funny, or just downright tragic. And if the social links weren't charming enough in their own right, they also affected taking your team into battle. Your allies gained new abilities as they progressed through their own side stories, making for much more engaging and connected systems. The Golden re-release of Persona 4 was naturally the definitive edition with more of everything. Dungeons, social links, personas, and an extended epilogue. Freeing the game from its late-stage PS2 release was a kind gesture, but bringing it to the PS Vita didn't really help the sales numbers. Thankfully, the modern multi-format port means that it's easier than ever to enjoy the best game on the Vita and the best PlayStation release of 2012. 2013, The Last of Us. When you think of 2013 in the games industry, there are inevitably two things that come to mind: Grand Theft Auto 5 and the year of Luigi. No, wait, that's not right. One of the many things that made The Last of Us great was that it held no quarter. There was no flair for the sake of entertainment, nor compromise in the tale to make sure players walked away feeling triumphant. The horror of the post-apocalypse was at the helm, with the worst of it laid bare as Joel and Ellie made their long journey to the story's bitter end. But it wasn't brutality for brutality's sake either, physically or emotionally speaking. There was a sense of purpose behind every development that deepened the world and affected the characters and their relationship, making it so easy to be immersed. Unlike most games up to this point, there was a less clear delineation between gameplay and story. The Last of Us moved seamlessly from one to the other and often overlapped. Where the narrative is clearly the strong point of The Last of Us, the gameplay was still solid, making nods to survival horror with its limited combat solutions and on-the-fly item crafting. It forced players to assess situations, apply stealth, and often consider escape as a victory rather than standing on top of a pile of bodies. The Last of Us didn't need to add crazy new mechanics, it simply changed the industry by treating the moment-to-moment as the overall vision, becoming perhaps the most important PlayStation first-party title of all time. 2014 PT. It was a worrying sign following the PS3 era that the PlayStation 4's first couple of years were middling at best when it came to exclusives. In 2014, Drive Club missed the mark for most people, but at least Infamous Second Son and Little Big Planet 3 were both decent. One release that can definitely be attributed to selling PlayStation 4 units, even if it was second-hand ones that still had the game on after it was removed from the store, was PT. The once and never Silent Hill project leaned a brand new way into the series' psychological horror. With only a simple repeating corridor to explore, players were constantly dangled over the edge of the next big scare, forced to push themselves through the door and search again for what might have changed. The incredible lack of enemies somehow didn't negate the desire to defend yourself from what lurked around each consecutive loop. It was impossible to pull yourself away, and yet PT's atmosphere was so dreadfully thick you daren't look directly at it. Who knows what Silent Hills would have been before its unceremonious cancellation and the demo's subsequent removal from the PlayStation Store, but PT was one of the biggest stories in gaming in 2014 with every development. Despite only being a teaser, it captured the imagination of thousands, altering the trajectory of horror gaming for the next decade, with both indie and major studios taking influence from that snuffed out spark of genius that Kojima, Del Toro and their team had crafted. You simply can't say the same for Infamous Second Son. Okay, we're in the end zone now. 2015, we're in the top 10. 2015, Bloodborne. Since the explosion of the original Dark Souls, everybody has wanted a Souls-like for themselves. You get a Souls-like, and you get a Souls-like, and you get a Souls-like, and you get a Souls-like. PlayStation, bully for them, might have got perhaps the most beloved title from both the genre and its monarch From Software themselves in 2015, with Bloodborne. Swapping the more defensive play of Dark Souls for something more offensive made Bloodborne feel familiar yet totally different. Weapons now had multiple forms and functions, players were rewarded for counter-attacking with health boosts, and the formula therefore shifted to being a game less about timing your escape and more about keeping on the pressure. Intricate design permeated Bloodborne from its graphics down to its world building and the item descriptions. More than any other FromSoft game to this point, Bloodborne filled players with the desire to experience and know everything. Wield every weapon, slay every beast, find every secret, and try to unravel its vague but not obtuse story. What made this remarkable was that Yharnam and its twisted inhabitants should have screamed at players to stay away. The bleak story, the grotesque monsters, and the oppressive gothic world, and yet not only is Bloodborne beloved, people have been asking for more of it ever since release. No matter what From Software continue to develop, nothing will compare to Bloodborne's suffocating level of atmosphere. Bloodborne created a world more complete in one entry than most games strive for in an entire franchise. 2016 Uncharted 4: A Thief's End. Uncharted 4 goes to prove that sometimes if something isn't broken, you don't need to attempt to fix it. Just make it bigger, deeper, and add a driving section to it. Whilst Uncharted 3 was a great game, retrospectively it wasn't the ending that Nathan Drake and company deserved. With The Last of Us now in Naughty Dog's rear view, they could stand to write a conclusion with the right amount of emotional pathos. As such, A Thief's End somehow brought a trilogy without a truly bad game to a whole new level previously unthought of. As with every installment in the series, the improvements were incremental across the board. Moving from the PS3 to the PS4 of course meant more realistic animation, gorgeous graphics, and mocap that helped to carry the deeper story. The set pieces were bigger and more ridiculous than ever, but equally the slower moments took advantage of the system by adding quasi-open levels where players have more opportunity to explore for secrets or find a route to the objective or around danger. It's really important that Uncharted didn't arbitrarily just go open world, but these moments of freedom were some of the most memorable in the game. Every review or recap or really any video on Uncharted has compared it to an action movie. Pretty sure I did it earlier, Uncharted's action movie gameplay, but A Thief's End was so much of a worthy cinematic jump that it made the previous games look like the tie-in TV series. There are few video game finales as good as Uncharted 4. 2017 Horizon Zero Dawn. Sony's desire to lean into narrative-heavy single-player games really helped the PlayStation 4 find its feet after a rocky previous generation. There were plenty of great examples, but sitting in the middle was perhaps the most special: Horizon Zero Dawn. A brand new IP is always a gamble, but Guerrilla Games were onto a winner from the word go with Horizon, which became the biggest new IP of the PS4 generation. Zero Dawn remains one of the generation's best lookers. The roving mountainsides of Colorado were interrupted by juts of metal and inhabited by dangerous animal-shaped machines. Both settlements across the land and bunkers underground told different stories of how this post-apocalyptic world came to be, combining open-world discovery and a linear authored plot that constantly answered questions in a way that posed more, prompting players to explore further and deeper. And across this lush world, the player clashed with a buffet of bots, utilising various strategies to get the jump on them, trick them into facing each other, or simply fighting them head-on yourself. Combat was immensely satisfying, tearing parts off your opponents and exploiting weaknesses in often nail-biting exchanges. The odd flaws were far overshadowed by the innumerable reasons to fall in love with Zero Dawn, and it's really no surprise that Horizon won several end-of-year awards and found its place within Sony's most prized possessions. 2018 God of War. It's a fair criticism that Sony hasn't done nearly enough in the last 30 years to celebrate the incredible catalogue of games and characters in their history. This is one of the many reasons God of War pips Spider-Man to the post out of the two truly stunning PlayStation exclusives in 2018. Another is that Santa Monica Studios were given the unenviable task of pushing everything forward and delivering with gusto. The 2018 reset introduced a Kratos changed by time and experience, now located in the realm of Norse mythology, all controlled in a weightier and more precise gameplay loop. And yet, with true finesse, retained what made the prior games so engaging. The gorgeous rendering of the world was brought to life by both its impressive sense of scale and fluid exploration, action, as the game disguised the line between open world and linear adventure perfectly. The combat was satisfying, even more so with the degree of control the player had over Kratos' skill set without falling too far into complexity. Whilst God of War's reveal is the stuff of legend, now what's most important is the landing, and the 2018 title brought the franchise to new heights both critically and commercially. A video that should never be forgotten is director Cory Barlog's teary reaction to the immediate love the game got on release, calling himself so effing proud. As he should be, God of War 2018 is subjectively a masterpiece that defined the PlayStation 4. 2019, Persona 5 Royal. With Persona 5 releasing to critical and commercial acclaim across 2016 and 2017, its inevitable re-release was one that could be met with suspicion. After all, Persona 5 had been, both in terms of the size of the game and its reaction, huge. P5 had brought the franchise a new level of mainstream attention in the West, and its 100+ hour campaign was universally praised. And yet, Persona 5 Royal, with a new dungeon, multiple new major characters, and a whole new ending, became the definitive version of the experience, and in many ways, the genre at the time. Persona 5 Royal represented a more complete experience, perfect for newcomers and rewarding for returning Phantom Thieves on every level. Bosses were reworked, dungeons had more content and traversal options, and the roguelike Momentous was fully fleshed out. It finally had more than one, count it, one piece of looping music. Thank goodness. There was also far more to do with your teammates in your free time, and the way that this then folded back into the combat was more rewarding than ever. Allies that you've gotten to know would support you better in battle, able to tag in, snap you out of status ailments, and perform impressive combo moves. In an era where classic genre giants were losing their identity and becoming part of a very non-specific action RPG moniker, Persona 5's boldness to commit to turn-based battles, monster collecting, and deeper character interactions rewarded JRPG fans for their patience. Persona 5 seemed to sharpen the series' strength to a point, and Royal showed that there can always be more of a good thing. 2020 Ghost of Tsushima. Whilst 2020 was a pretty terrible year for just about everyone, it was at least a decent year for video games. PlayStation had a big three of exclusives: the long-awaited Final Fantasy VII Remake, the apparently controversial masterpiece that was The Last of Us Part 2, and a wonderful little adventure from Sucker Punch by the name of Ghost of Tsushima. Considering the state of the world in 2020, this might well have been the most important title of the three, and just for clarity, my Twitter followers tended to agree, and what are you gonna do? Argue with people on the internet? Unthinkable. More than just a cool concept which paid respectful homage to samurai motion pictures, Ghost of Tsushima dared to be more than just a historical Japanese open world. Whilst the stealth might have been unfortunately lacking, Ghost of Tsushima's head-on combat was a brilliant display of building outwards from a simple system. Sword fighting variety came in the form of stances, with each one exciting to get to grips with, and the choice of stream of constant new abilities over a tired level up system was a breath of fresh air. This was also true of the game's minimal HUD, as the player chases the wind across the gorgeous island of Tsushima, taking part in some truly engaging side content alongside the main campaign that not only helped to teach players about Tsushima's history and people, but also its geography. As previously noted, the PS4 is a system that will be remembered for its deep single-player experiences, ergo Ghost of Tsushima's thorough level of immersion was the perfect game to lose oneself in to see off the end of the generation and a horrible year. 2021, Ratchet & Clank Rift Apart. Remake aside, Ratchet & Clank missed 8 years and a whole console generation between Into the Nexus and Rift Apart, and in that time, mascot platformers were few and far between. So it was incredibly gratifying to see the PS5 debut of the duo land in both the franchise's best sellers and its best scorers. Most wonderfully, it was and may still remain the best advertisement of the PlayStation 5's power, with Dimensions being the main gimmick. Having an adventure game that can instantly and seamlessly jump from one world to another was mind-blowing. Not to mention the lighting, the colour palette, and the particle effects that fly in every direction during combat with absolutely no drop in visual fidelity. The comparisons to the 2002 game were clear. Once again, Insomniac put together a stunning, diverse, detail-heavy game that pulled players along in the name of fun. But lest we forget that Insomniac games are much more than visual delights, Ratchet & Clank had that Moorish feeling that the studio routinely crafts. Whilst technically more linear than than other games in the series, Rift Apart still gives players plenty of choice, weapons, upgrades and so on, and then pulls them by the long back's ears into a riotous adventure. In a time where video games strive to be cutting edge, they sometimes lose sight of the fun, and Ratchet & Clank Rift Apart oozes joy from every dimension-hopping pore. 2022 God of War Ragnarok. It's easy to criticise Sony for their recent spate of iterative sequels, but it truly was hard to pick many genuine faults with God of War Ragnarok. It might have taken its time to get into the best of what the experience had to offer, but when it got there, Ragnarok delivered on a storytelling and thematic level in a way that even exceeded its 2018 forebearer. The relationship between Kratos and his son Atreus was fully brought to bear in gameplay. Combat was more improved in small ways across the board to produce an overall more satisfying experience. The blurred line of open world and authored campaign was walked tightly again, but allowed players to truly get lost in the Norse realm. Whilst the main campaign was stuffed with locational and enemy variety to keep things fresh, its fulfilling side content was similarly worthwhile. God of War Ragnarok was a game of real wow moments, made possible by the powerhouse that was the PlayStation 5 and brought to life by some stunning character performances. Christopher Judge's thunderous performance as Kratos was a particular achievement and won one of the game's 6 BAFTAs from its record-setting 13 nominations. Of course, building from 2018's God of War, which was such a tight package, means that there were arguments to be made that Ragnarok suffered some pacing issues and perhaps added just a few too many ingredients to the stew. Whilst the jury is still out on which game is superior, it's fair to say that Santa Monica at least made a companion piece in Ragnarok that was worthy of Kratos' blades. 2023 Final Fantasy XVI. One of the hardest choices to make on this list, if for no other reason than the fear I will be whipped up to the ceiling by angry Spider-Man fans. But what made Final Fantasy XVI such a delight was that it was both a return to form for a franchise that had fallen from its throne and something entirely unexpected. Best of all, it stood confident in a way the series hadn't for a long time. This was immediately obvious from the game's story and world building. Unlike most other mainline FF titles from the last decade, Final Fantasy XVI is designed to feel like a complete experience. The game was measured in its pace but thorough in its execution. Like God of War Ragnarok the year prior, Final Fantasy XVI tied its thematics across the entire experience. Whether it was facing down the cruel ruling class in screen-filling boss fights or delivering hot meals to the impoverished, the game was all about working towards a better world for others on macro and micro levels. As such, having Clyde Rosfield as the singular playable character, which seemed alien to longtime FF fans at a glance, totally made sense. Final Fantasy XVI's combat was no slouch, heavy, immediate and satisfying. What started as simple hacking and slashing grew to include a tool set of abilities and skills that could be swapped out on the fly to craft some truly incredible battle scenes. That said, it wouldn't be Final Fantasy without a certain degree of production, and the first talking point upon FF16's release was that the set pieces here were some of the best in the series. The icon battles were spectacle like nothing gaming had done before or since, and a hugely rewarding high point when it came to story pathos. Sure, it might not have been what every Final Fantasy fan wanted, but with a series running so dehydrated for so long, Final Fantasy XVI was an oasis. And finally, 2024, Helldivers 2. Even if it doesn't land amongst the best of the year, at the very least, Helldivers 2 can claim a prize at being the most pleasant surprise of 2024. While the industry deals with numerous problems in the AAA space like development cost and return, Helldivers 2 was able to spring forth from the earth with a mischievous grin on its face, somehow becoming the fastest selling PlayStation game ever. It's the power of word of mouth at play. Gamers flocked to a reasonably priced multiplayer shooter to enjoy with friends without the predatory microtransactions that have hobbled so many major franchises. Weapons feel weighty, objectives are numerous, and many worlds in need of liberation change the game feel with weather effects. Best of all, Arrowhead Studios have been very consistent with updates adding new content to the game. At its core, Helldivers is about emergent gameplay moments where players across the globe globe are working together for a common goal and accidentally crushing each other with weapons drops sometimes. The game has, and therefore fosters, a great sense of humour, and more to the point, there's no cynicism in Helldivers that often comes with the demands of the larger studios. We're all here just to have fun. Very few video games bring that feeling to the forefront, asking players to collaborate for a greater goal, even if that goal is somewhat ironic in its tone. Helldivers 2, if nothing else, will hopefully be remembered as a great coming together of gamers to celebrate and enjoy a game that is all about player satisfaction more than it is about filling the pockets of the studio heads.
There is no better company for tracking the history of gaming than Nintendo, from capturing the imagination of kids and adults alike with the splendour of the Famicom and NES, all the way to the stranglehold that the Nintendo Switch has over all of us. Nintendo has seen it all and been it all.
But what's the secret to their success? Perhaps the best way to learn that is to go through their entire console history and pick out the best game of every year. If nothing else, it's a good way to spend about an hour or so.
First of all, some important definitions. Nintendo in this video refers to any and all systems released by the company starting from the Famicom onwards and doesn't necessarily mean first party only. However, like our Xbox and PlayStation videos of the same kind, this article will only take into account console exclusives, including timed releases and, in a few cases, arcade games that made their home on Nintendo systems. So get settled, because I'm Sai, this is What Culture, and this is the best Nintendo game of every year from 1983 to 2024.
And as Mario might say, here we go.
1983, Donkey Kong. 1983 might be the single most important year in all of gaming history when you get right down to it. The rise in Japanese developers had an open path to dominance in the wake of the American video game crash, and Nintendo couldn't have picked a better year to introduce their first ever home console. The Famicom Entertainment System arrived in the Japanese market in July 1983, bringing some of the company's biggest arcade hits with it. Chief among them, of course, was Donkey Kong. Just on the surface, the game introduced us to both DK and Mario, two of Nintendo's most enduring mascots, even if they have vastly transformed along the way. Whilst the game can't necessarily be called the single point of origin for the platforming genre, many people take for granted that its main mechanic of having the player jump gaps and obstacles changed everything.
That in itself is an awesome legacy, but it also gave us people so obsessed with world record scores that they got into legal battles over whether or not they cheated to obtain them, which is a pretty unique claim to fame too.
1984, Excitebike. Speaking of things we immediately took for granted, how does smooth horizontal scrolling grab you? No, Excitebike wasn't the first to showcase this, but it certainly pushed things forward with how quickly it appeared to do so when other systems were yet to confidently get the basics down. Shigeru Miyamoto's Motocross Racer was a huge deal for home console sports games for so many reasons, not least because it was intuitive and fun. Avoiding obstacles, other racers, and overheating made for a challenging and exciting title. Hence the name, really. It's also absolutely worth mentioning the design mode, which allowed players to create custom tracks. The Famicom data recorder device, which was exclusive to Japan, meant that drivers could save and then load these creations. Additionally, in the first year of Nintendo's foray into the US, Excitebike landed as the third best seller behind Pac-In's Mario Bros. And Duck Hunt, meaning it was the game most people gravitated towards to add to their game library. Neat. 1985, Super Mario Bros.
If Donkey Kong was the hop and 1983's first lead outing Mario Bros. Was the skip, then 1985's Super Mario Bros. Was the giant leap for Nintendo's mustachioed main man.
There aren't really enough superlatives to explain how important the game was. Most version of the Famicom's Western redesign, the Nintendo Entertainment System, came packed with Super Mario Bros. This meant that it had the responsibility of washing the low bar of quality from the late 70s and early 80s out of the memories of consumers, whilst introducing a new world of gaming as designed by Nintendo and Shigeru Miyamoto. World 1.1 taught players everything they needed to know as they navigated, for the first time ever, a world that scrolled as they moved forwards. With simple but clean graphics and instantly catchy music, Super Mario Bros. Was more than just a score-chasing arcade game. It was an obstacle course of challenge and wonder, continuously surprising players with new stage gimmicks and hidden secrets that the whole family could partake in. And that right there That's basically the Nintendo blueprint. 1986, The Legend of Zelda.
By the time 1986 rolled around, with the NES now appearing around the world, the Famicom was really hitting its stride, with massive franchises like Metroid, Castlevania, and Dragon Quest taking their first steps.
With so much new IP, the closest to a sure thing was the next release from Super Mario genius Miyamoto, and so Nintendo sold over 1 million copies in Japan on the game's release day, and those 1 million fans went home with a game which changed the industry forever: The Legend of Zelda. Console games had never been this involving before, demanding players immerse themselves in its top-down world, which came printed on a paper map, in order to get the most out of it. Hyrule was as diverse as an 8-bit experience could be, filled with dangers to conquer, but also mysteries that rewarded the player's curiosity. The ability to go on an adventure from your own home summoned an unmatched sense of wonder. More than a genre, The Legend of Zelda created a tone and a feeling that gamers sought after. 1987, Final Fantasy. Inspired by Zelda, Dragon Quest, and the likes of the PC RPG Ultima, Square throwing their feathered cap into the ring led to perhaps the biggest RPG franchise to this day. One of the reasons for this is production quality. Final Fantasy's graphics were lush and interesting on the overworld, in dungeons, and during battle, where players would see their carefully selected and named 4 warriors of light in all of their glory taking commands. Every new area was set to unique music, the intricacy of which pushed what was expected out of the machine. But the real drive of Final Fantasy was its story. Whilst it was dialogue light by today's standards, the game felt like a whole series of novels squeezed into a single cartridge. Your friends who read The Lord of the Rings might have had lots of details to share with you, but you could say that you encountered the pirates, you encountered the vampires, you encountered the dragons, and experienced the shocking twist at the end of Final Fantasy.
The era of epics had arrived, at least contemporarily speaking.
1988, Mega Man 2. For a time, video game developers weren't necessarily sure how to approach sequels. In many ways, Capcom's Mega Man 2 showed that more of the same was absolutely a viable option. Mega Man already had an air of coolness that most other games struggled to crack, with strong character designs, bold use of colour to craft a set of immediately identifiable stages.
And let's be clear, Mega Man 2's soundtrack is goated, and it deserves its spot just for this alone. But I can't just talk about music, so it's a good thing that it's a great game too.
Mega Man 2 set a standard that the franchise and other games chased forevermore on all of these fronts and then some. The game was punishingly hard, only made fair by its tight controls. Mistakes were on the player's head, but the addictive feeling of piloting the heavy rock and the drive of the incredible design kept players coming back over and over, only to lose to Quickman yet again. It's got a lot of strong competition, but often being called the greatest 2D platformer of all time isn't bad for an iterative sequel. 1989, Castlevania 3, Dracula's Curse. Speaking of iterative sequels, this is not a term that could be said about Castlevania 2, Simon's Quest. Applying RPG and adventure game elements to the monster battling basics proved divisive at best, and a total train wreck at worst. And so 1989's Castlevania 3 went back to formula.
Back to formula?
That's not to say that Konami hadn't learned lessons from pushing the envelope. Whilst the classic ultra-hard platforming of the first game was once more the focus, Dracula's Curse gave players choice and replayability by allowing multiple paths to the titular castle. It also, for the first time, offered completely different playstyles as Trevor Belmont built his team on his way to whip Dracula's fangs down his throat. But first, that team would need to navigate devilish enemy placements and punishing boss fights.
Make no mistake, this game wasn't necessarily the hardest NES game, but unlike, say, a Battletoads, it was satisfying enough to make you strive for greatness.
Castlevania 3 may not have been a sales giant for the system, especially releasing late into its life, but it's fondly remembered as a connoisseur's choice. 1990, F-Zero.
It's very bold of me to select something other than Super Mario World for 1990, but to distract you from that, you know what's even bolder? Using your underdog marketing to directly call out your competition.
Genesis does what Nintendo don't, was the battle cry of Sega that their console and its so-called blast processing was capable of far more than Nintendo's new machine. But Ninty let their games do the talking, and F-Zero screamed into high gear in a way that made players' jaws drop. The ingenious ingenious use of Mode 7, the overclocked frame rate, and the astounding 16-bit soundtrack meant that console gaming had rarely felt so futuristic and exciting. Where some games used Mode 7 sparingly but effectively, it was the core component of Nintendo's Sci-Fi Racer. This enabled players to see far more of the track ahead of them and gave the incredible illusion of 3D, allowing the team to construct a wholly original racing game, which is another notch on Captain Falcon's bounty hunting belt. While Super Famicom games release at a steady pace, the console launched in Japan with 2 titles. One of these was the wonderful but safe Super Mario World. The other was this intense racing IP that came out of nowhere and left Sega lusting for a super fast title of their own. 1991, The Legend of Zelda: A Link to the Past. And so, in 1991, Sega released Sonic the Hedgehog. Nintendo was about to have some real competition, and for a little while, even become the number 2 company in the console space. Fighting back in their honour, however, was what would start to shape itself as one of the Big N's most important properties. Zelda: A Link to the Past fleshed out everything that came before so naturally that it almost feels obvious, adding the likes of the Master Sword and a lot of the real history and lore of Hyrule. A Hyrule that was not just gorgeous and vibrant, but full of surprises. The biggest of which was the shock that the game had 2 massive maps. Most impressively, swapping from one to the other only took a couple of seconds, and yet, like the top-down perspective of the first game had done before, it forced players to think about their exploration in a totally fresh way. It's hard to nail down everything A Link to the Past did right, as like the original game, it was so often about a feeling. There was so much pure joy oozing from every pore of Link's 1991 adventure that it still felt by fans both old and new today. 1992, Dragon Quest V. It's important to know that the likes of Zelda and Final Fantasy don't get to where they are without Yuji Horii and Dragon Quest. The originator of the Japanese RPG, most entries in the franchise are in the running for gold in their respective years, but Dragon Quest V was particularly special. The game starts with the birth of the player character and follows them through the transitional moments of their life, the death of their parents, marriage, childbirth, and a search for identity that pervades through it all. Your wife and kids being part of the story and playable characters rather than a roving pack of wandering heroes was a simple stroke of genius. It makes for an incredibly intimate and personal tale set within a familiar framework of a bombastic adventure. On top of this, the adventure introduces the now serious staple monster collecting to serve as the bulk of your party, and a revised and more customizable tactic system for battle. Sure, Dragon Quest V was fairly criticised for not evolving its visuals or UI as a debut entry for the system, however, it was easy to forgive the game's faults when the story was this touching and personal.
The only thing unforgivable was making players outside of Japan wait over 16 years for a port.
1993, Star Fox. Whereas in certain generations the next major milestone of gaming isn't necessarily obvious and might simply boil down to more power, the advent of 3D gaming was a clear horizon that the industry was moving towards. For a time, many franchises implemented tricks to use 2D elements in a way that appeared to give them more depth, like Mode 7 in fact. Star Fox was not one of these games. Famously the first game to feature Argonaut's Super FX chip built into the cartridge, the 1993 sci-fi rail shooter was the first home console game to feature 3D polygonal graphics. It was simply stunning that a machine that hadn't been natively designed to produce such effects did so this flawlessly. Star Fox was fast and frantic with a thumping soundtrack to match, and like the sharp points of the game's polygonal R-wing, was cutting edge. The game was a breath of fresh air, a worthy contribution to any SNES owner's collection, and revolutionised gaming. 1994, Super Metroid. Speaking of which, there are a handful of titles out there that can claim they shook gaming to its core, but very few have entire genres named after them. Whilst Super wasn't the first Metroid game, it was absolutely the one that perfected the formula. Samus Aran's third outing, even more than the previous two, ingeniously presented something that filled a niche, an adventure with a tight yet winding, interconnected and constantly unfolding map that spoke to players who were tired of running from left to right to finish individual stages, but also weren't fans of full-on RPGs. It also almost wordlessly communicated a beautiful tale that really flipped the perspective of the parasitic Metroid creatures. It may not be one of the console's best sellers, but to this day, Super Metroid is still beloved and heralded as not just one of the best games in its series, but of the genre it helped create. Players all over the world 20 years later are still enjoying it pure and otherwise breaking it with speedruns and randomizers.
This level of devotion doesn't happen without Super Metroid being a deeply satisfying game to play, with tight controls, luscious 16-bit locations to explore, and a deeply moody soundtrack.
1995, Chrono Trigger. Every now and then in life, the stars come together to create something truly special. In the case of 95, the stars were Final Fantasy creator Hironobu Sakaguchi, Dragon Quest creator Yuji Horii, and famed designer Akira Toriyama, and the something special was RPG genre giant Chrono Trigger. Chrono Trigger innovated by introducing New Game Plus to the world, which worked wonderfully for a game that had so many missable events and alternative outcomes, such as some pretty major differences to the composition of your final party. It also more obviously set its turn-based battles in the overworld, taking advantage of a 32 megabit cartridge to smoothly transition from exploration to blasting poor boundalos into oblivion with some incredible looking combo attacks. Every part of Chrono Trigger was a shining example of how far gaming had come. The game contained some of the most gorgeous sprite work and animation ever seen, which helped to bring to life a story that moved effortlessly from tragic and emotional to goofy and slapstick. Said story, which dealt with time travel, had an incredibly rewarding pace, always setting up the next event before the last one closed up, drawing players onwards to the next time period.
Chrono Trigger was the perfect way to say goodbye to the Super Nintendo, and might well be the best the system has to offer. Period.
1996, Pokemon Red, Green and Blue. The Game Boy was released in 1989 and became the Nintendo console with the longest lifespan before being replaced by its successor. However, it's not appeared thus far simply because Nintendo's home consoles were always producing the biggest games year on year. And that's not to say that wasn't the case with 96 too, as this year the Nintendo 64 arrived and brought with it the likes of Wave Race 64, Mario Kart 64 and 3D platforming Revolution Super Mario 64. None of these were quite on the same level as Game Freak's Pocket Monsters, however.
Spawning an anime, mangas, movies, trading cards, action figures, plushies, board games, those bouncy ball things that had the Pokemon inside and you'd try and bite through to get the Pokemon. That wasn't just me, was it?
Despite the unstoppable wave of marketing and merchandising and the fact that creator Satoshi Tajiri made arguably four versions of the same game, the heart of the first generation of Pokemon was undeniably pure. Born from a love of bug collecting and RPG games, Pokemon Red and Blue's easy-to-understand battle system, which paired up creatures that ranged from adorable to kick-ass, was not just a stroke of genius, but something that truly had a lot of soul. Its approachability set legions of non-gamers off on an epic journey in which they had total control, planning and constructing a party, swapping stories, and even Pokemon themselves with friends in order to track down and collect all 150, or 151 if you believe the playground rumours, and become the ultimate master trainer.
Pokemania was a phenomenon the likes of which gaming wouldn't see again until Fortnite Battle Royale.
1997, GoldenEye 007. When Sony released the PlayStation in 1994, they did so knowing that Nintendo's hold on all ages gaming was firm and therefore they could aim for a more mature audience.
But 1997 saw the release of the game that had PlayStation consumers visiting their N64 owning friends and family and getting to grips with the awkwardly shaped three-pronged controller to play the FPS game that was setting the world on fire.
GoldenEye 007 was a landmark moment in the shooter genre, being the most approachable and feature-heavy FPS to land on a console. It allowed players to more precisely aim around the screen and rewarded them with different hit reactions depending on where their shots landed. There was stealth, there was dual wielding, and there were a host of mad cheats to offer variety to the experience. Best of all, it supported 4-player multiplayer for split-screen carnage. Finally, the joys felt by PC shooter players could be realised on a wider scale. And it worked wonders for Nintendo and Rare, as every player who got to try GoldenEye at a friend's house was inspired to purchase it, making it the best-selling game for the system without the word Mario in the title. 1998, The Legend of Zelda: Ocarina of Time.
As previously noted in the PlayStation list of the same type, 1998 was one of the best years in gaming history. No matter what console you had, you were eating good, and the N64 had several great titles to choose from, but if there was ever a nailed-on entry for this video at all, It's Ocarina of Time.
If you know literally anything at all about video games, you know how important and beloved Ocarina of Time is. It's a title that entered the Video Game Hall of Fame on its first nomination, has been given endless retrospective rewards, and is the highest rated game on Metacritic with a near perfect score of 99. Whilst time may not have been kind to its visuals and the franchise has arguably iterated Ocarina into redundancy, there's still a beautiful spark in Link's first 3D outing. And that is the spirit of adventure, a wonderment clearly felt by the artists and developers who produced it that they were breaking new ground. The world of Hyrule felt diverse, huge, and full of secrets that, whilst recognisable to what came before, required the player to think again in new ways. It's truly astounding how much the team got right on the first published attempt, as Zelda would use Ocarina as a blueprint. Heck, so would a lot of other adventure games for the next 2 decades. With both of Nintendo's mascots translating over so well, the era of 3D had truly arrived. 1999 Mario Party 2. Whilst 99 saw many memorable titles land for the N64, Mario Party 2 should be recognised as the sequel that set up one of Nintendo's most prolific franchises. Making the original game look more like a proof of concept in retrospect, Mario Party 2 put into place so many series staples. More than just better boards and better mini-games, the title introduced duel and battle mechanics to add more direct competitive experiences. It's strange now to think the first game didn't even have items, and that was something that the sequel introduced. It also finally gave players a chance to practice before playing each game, meaning everyone had a chance to understand what was going on beforehand.
You were no longer exclaiming, "Oh, I think I'm getting this now," just as your friend completes every single mini-game. Sorry, flashbacks.
One of the N64's biggest strengths over its competitors was native 4-player support, a shrewd decision that Nintendo made the best of time and time again. The Mario Party series was a big part of the console's multiplayer lineup, with the second game in particular still held aloft as the superstar of the series. 2000 Paper Mario. On the other hand, one thing that the Nintendo 64 had an almost total lack of were classic role-playing games. The restrictions of cartridges over the PlayStation and Saturn's disc drives were such a difference maker that Square left Nintendo in the lurch to craft Final Fantasy VII for the PS1, leaving the big N without a developer for the follow-up to SNES cult classic Super Mario RPG. Instead, the jilted ex-lover Nintendo began crafting the follow-up themselves. Inspired by the so-called ultra-realism of 3D graphics at the time, Nintendo wanted Paper Mario to be a cuter and more charming affair than something like Super Mario 64. This birthed the unique papercraft aesthetic, stage playset battle arena, and a Mario who had never shown so much personality before. Paper Mario's all-ages vibe might not seem like it makes for the deepest role player, but it had plenty going for it. Timed button presses and flicks of the stick, depending on the kinds of attacks that Mario and its allies were utilising, caused more damage. There was the badge system for giving characters passive buffs, and outside of battle, each of Mario's allies' unique abilities could be used to navigate the world or find secrets. It might not be the first Mario RPG, and its sequel might be a better game overall, but it's absolutely the most important, as it created a franchise in its own right and inspired the separate Mario and Luigi series. 2001 Super Smash Bros. Melee. Whilst the GameCube era might not have been Nintendo's strongest financially, it produced plenty of solid gold classics. One of the best came in just the first few months of the console's time on the market. Super Smash Bros. Melee was the wine squeezed from the grapes of its predecessor, but its true strength was the perfect balance of its content. The character roster felt massive, but not intimidating in the various modes.
Classic, adventure, all-star, that one where you take your middle school angst out on a sandbag.
Kept players entertained whilst helping them to get better at the fundamentals.
Or you could just turn all the items on very high and let chaos reign.
It made for a deeply replayable package assisted by its superb engine that far outlived the GameCube itself. Even with multiple sequels in later generations, Melee's swift, heavy and exploitable engine set the groundwork for Nintendo's first esport, accidental or otherwise. More than anything, Melee took the concept of the Nintendo Party Fighter to a level that made it gaming's premier crossover event. Just the opening video weaving through the likes of Zelda, Kirby, Star Fox, and surprising choices at least to Westerners like NES. The first 90 seconds was Nintendo hype like we had never have before, and it became the console's killer multiplayer app for a long time. 2002 Metroid Prime. Despite clearly wanting to do more, Metroid is one of the franchises that Nintendo has struggled with most. Historically, the games have always sold better internationally than in Japan, so in a way it made sense to boldly hand off development of the franchise to a Western team. Retro Studios' shift to a first-person perspective sent fans into a terrified frenzy on its first reveal. But when Metroid Prime landed, first in America, a rare occurrence, the talk went flat. It was a refreshing reboot for a series that had been dormant for nearly a decade. Still, a lot connected the new Metroid style to its forebears. The precision-based shooting in its exploration and boss fights was more evident than ever, and there was the same thick, lonely atmosphere that players expected, with each locale stuffed with secrets to find and mysteries to unravel. Couple this with brilliant immersive touches that made players feel like they were inhabiting Samus's power suit, and the game connected with Nintendo's older audience who were hungry for games that pushed the envelope.
Samus had finally proven she could viably walk both the 2D and the 3D path and offer something different. To this day, both Super Metroid and Metroid Prime are the golden stars of the franchise, with the number one podium purely coming down to personal preference.
2003, Beautiful Joe. Nintendo have a long and checkered history when it comes to third-party support, partly in thanks to their choice of hardware. First cartridges and now proprietary mini-discs, but regardless, they managed to land a pretty sweet deal with Capcom to bolster their library in 2002.
This was a series of GameCube exclusive titles called the Capcom 5, of which only 4 were released and only 1 remained exclusive, which has to be one of gaming's funniest ironies.
The second of these was Beautiful Joe. In an era that was embracing realism, 3D exploration, and adult themes, Hideki Kamiya's stylish action platform went almost the opposite way every time. 3D environments were merely a background for a classic 2D beat-em-up, visuals were vibrantly cel-shaded, and goofy writing that was full of referential humour. Inspired by tokusatsu film in Japan like Super Sentai and Kamen Rider, Beautiful Joe's full embrace of the love of movies also made for a unique gameplay hook that utilised slow motion and after images in both combat and puzzle solving. It was a game that was bursting with joy for its inspirations and its own world. A game with this kind of oddball character could have only debuted on the GameCube. It may not have sold well, but Beautiful Joe made a believer of every player who picked it up in 2003 and beyond. 2004, Pikmin 2. Since Nintendo has a few core franchises they reliably lean on, it often falls to the new IP to truly define a generation. With the little purple lunchbox, the most noteworthy might be Pikmin, with the first game in 2001 and its stunning sequel 3 years later. With every new franchise, the first entry is often about proving that it can work, and the original Pikmin was a charming and cutesy facade on a deceptively tactical strategy adventure. Pikmin 2 took the formula and tweaked certain parts of it just enough to stand alone and debatably set itself as the apex of the franchise even to this day. Commanding Pikmin with the GameCube controller was more satisfying than ever, and Pikmin 2 offered a much higher skill ceiling despite the loss of the first game's strict campaign timer. In its stead, players battled competitively with friends, explored challenging dungeons, and ran in fright of a terrifying semi-transparent man with bulldozers for hands and feet.
The absolute fight or flight response this thing set off in me when it reappeared in Pikmin 4. Thanks, Miyamoto!
The series might not be for everyone, but Pikmin's incredibly unique vibe is what makes it such a delight, and Pikmin 2 is the most rewarding for those that really connect with that vibe. 2005, Resident Evil 4.
At this point, Resident Evil 4 has been ported to so many systems that someone to check to see if it hasn't gained sentience and isn't intent on spreading itself to as many homes as possible in some kind of hostile takeover.
And whilst the PS2 version may be what brought the game its first big wave of sales, RE4 was originally part of the aforementioned Capcom 5 and exclusively made the GameCube its home for 10 months. Resident Evil 4 is one of those games that's been spoken about so much that there might be nothing new left to say. And for good reason. Heralded not just as one of the best games ever made, but as a title that revolutionized the third-person action game, RE4 still holds up 20 years and a remake later. Resident Evil 4 keeps players in its grasp with utterly addictive combat punctuated with fresh ideas and set pieces. There's protecting the president's daughter, a battle on a moving boat, quick-time events, shooting galleries, the terror of the rattling regenerators, and some frankly insane boss fights. Games on Nintendo systems are often in the conversation for Game of the Year, but rarely is there a more universally agreed title than 2005's Resident Evil 4, even if most of those votes probably came from PS2 players. 2006 Wii Sports. There's something very funny about the year 2006. Xbox owners were toiling in the war against the Locust in Gears of War. PlayStation fans were sneaking back through the forests of Metal Gear Solid 3 with a subsistence release.
And Nintendo players waggling around remotes pretending to play tennis.
And somehow, despite the out-of-nowhere bat-poo insanity of it all, the Nintendo Wii was an overnight sensation, becoming the company's biggest launch and being in demand for a lot of its first full year. Obviously, Wii Sports is the best-selling game for the console as it was the pack-in during the Wii's boom period, but this was very much the right call to make as it perfectly demonstrated what the console was all about. A simple compilation of 5 sporting events that were recognisable and easily adaptable to the system's motion controls, Wii Sports was something that most able-bodied people could pick up and enjoy almost right away. It doesn't have the depth or necessarily the artistic merit of Gears of War or Metal Gear Solid, but Nintendo's WAG Olympics helped many create memories with all kinds of people in their lives, and for that, we salute you, Wii Sports. 2007 Super Mario Galaxy.
And so a new Nintendo console arrives, and so too does the mustachioed inevitability.
Whilst both narrowly missing inclusion on this list, Mario 64 and Super Mario Sunshine were huge hits for their respective consoles, landing in the top and third sales slot respectively. Thankfully, whilst Mario Galaxy did use what the Wii could uniquely offer, it was at its core a traditional 3D Mario platformer. More than anything else, Mario Galaxy's biggest strength was in its wild sightseeing tour of Rosalina's wacky universe, with its constantly shifting gravity and its endless planetoids, each with different shapes, gimmicks and objectives. The game kept players engaged or addicted by retaining the most basic Mario gameplay but offering a continuous stream of something new to see. And here too, since Galaxy's lushly textured score was the first time Mario had an adventure to the sounds of a real orchestra. Perhaps the most consistently good 3D outing that Mario has ever been on, Galaxy would remain one of the best examples of what the Wii could achieve in terms of its graphics, as well as how innate motion controls could feel if done subtly. 2008 Mario Kart Wii. It's not surprising that when looking into which Mario Kart games frequently top the franchise in terms of fan favourites, the Wii edition is a regular number 1. After all, it sold like hot cakes, with even better hot cakes inside of them, and this is despite the fact that Mario Kart Wii is an infamously broken game, with speedrunners beating tracks in literal seconds by reversing and leaping over the finish line.
And the game turning Funky Kong into a superstar by virtue of him being blatantly faster than every other racer.
But in a sense, that's what made the game so fun. It had something for everyone. From the die-hard competitive racers with GameCube or Pro controllers, to your parents who wanted to try out the surprisingly enjoyable Wii Wheel. Mario Kart Wii appealed to the console's mix of demographics with chaotic casual racing and, for the first time ever, online play. Each sequel is a must-have for its respective Nintendo system, but rarely has an installment defined a console like Mario Kart Wii did. And it's not just because Wii's in the name. 2009 Grand Theft Auto Chinatown Wars.
And the award for the most surprising appearance from a franchise on a Nintendo list.
Now, it's not like Grand Theft Auto hadn't been on Nintendo platforms before, but Chinatown Wars was a brand new installment that, more than anything else, made full use of what the DS was capable of. Almost to an uncomfortable degree. There was something hilariously icky about selling and moving, for the YouTube censorship's sake, let's say, pharmaceuticals using a DS touchscreen, like you were getting away with something that Nintendo shouldn't know about. The game had lots of unique moments all throughout its campaign that used the console's gimmick, and they had plenty of variety, from filling up Molotov bottles and arming explosives, to setting up a sniper rifle and burning documents. The core gameplay was more akin to GTA's original top-down feel, but with the ability to move protagonist Lee around Liberty City on foot. It was a refreshing reminder of, and an update on, what came before GTA went full 3D. So whilst there were plenty of concessions that didn't put Chinatown Wars on the same scale as the PS2 games, it instead made something great out of what it could do. That is to say that whilst DS fans may be dismayed that the first appearance from the console here is a GTA game of all things, it turns out that Chinatown Wars is the highest rated title on the system.
Weird.
2010, Kirby's Epic Yarn.
Now look, Super Mario Galaxy 2, I hear ya, but it's really more of the same kind of sequel, even if that same is great. But we have talked about the original Galaxy, so let's agree to just shout it out here and give it the silver medal.
After all, 2010 was a weirdly busy year for Nintendo. The West got Professor Layton and the Unwound Future, on top of new releases from Donkey Kong, exclusive Sonic Colors,
and... what's that? Oh, it's Metroid Other M.
But the gold and every other colour of the rainbow goes to the joy in video game form that was Kirby's Epic Yarn, one of the year's most pleasant surprises. Turning the Kirby series into something totally fresh, it's funny to look back at Epic Yarn winning Best Graphics Awards for the year, but it truly deserved it, as few games had attempted such a handcrafted feel before. With the Wii in the home of plenty of families, the game was a no-brainer buy for those with young children, but there was still enough flair for people of all ages to enjoy. It was the attention to detail and the breadth of that detail that made Epic Yarn such a wonderful experience. Even though the game presented next to no challenge, for example, players couldn't die, there was always a reason to keep going. Each new stage presented new gimmicks, transformations, or just fun visual ideas that kept it captivating. 2011, Pokemon Black and White.
Returning to the DS now, when we're back to the world of stuffing cute critters into spheres and forcing them to fight cults and criminals and that next door neighbour that you have weird feelings about.
And there were more of those cute critters than ever by 2010's Black and White versions, which added a stonking 156 new designs. With the series perpetually trying to find the right place to draw the line between new and nostalgic, the fifth generation of games outright did away with the latter, populating the gorgeous United States-inspired Unova with all new Pokemon. This in itself was a bold and controversial move. But whilst the quality of the Pokemon will always be up for debate, Black and White received universal praise for its story that actually posed questions about the morality of stuffing cute critters into spheres. Its characters asked players shockingly poignant philosophical questions, which crescendoed into one of the best final acts in the series. Every Pokemon fan will have a different ranking of the games, and Black and White to many were already a step down from the previous year's Heart Gold and Soul Silver remakes, but they should be commended for what they did right. 2012, Zombie U. The Wii U's launch lineup consisted of a selection of lesser versions of third-party games like Batman Arkham City, Mass Effect 3, and Assassin's Creed 3. In terms of exclusives, the console didn't have a strong start.
The best of the bunch, though, unexpectedly, was a Ubisoft title.
Far from a perfect game, with review scores ranging from good to good enough, Zombie U was still an excellent addition to the Nintendo lineup for a few reasons. First of all, coming off the Wii, it represented hope that the company was more open-minded about signing off on more mature titles. Secondly, it was one of the more ingenious uses of the gamepad that the console ever saw in its lifespan. Set in London during a zombie apocalypse, players used the gamepad screen as a map and inventory. There was nothing quite like the tension of looking between the TV and the controller, expecting a monster to come looking for lunch whilst you rifled through your backpack, end up eaten, and you'd reload as another hopeful survivor, able to find your former zombified self, or even your zombified friends with online functions enabled.
Zombie U was a rare breath of fresh air in an otherwise moulding, rotting zombie genre, and its ports to other systems came with the caveat of it was better on the Wii U. You can't really say that about any other game.
2013, Super Mario 3D World.
Nintendo posited 2013 is the year of Luigi, so it's some kind of hilarious irony that even still, he got overshadowed.
This year saw the release of the Wii U's highest rated, second best selling game behind Mario Kart 8, and one that, despite launching on a console with a limited audience, smashed Mario's previous sales records to bits. Super Mario 3D World was the follow-up to 2011's 3DS title, and whilst it didn't make great use of the Wii U's gimmicks, it certainly felt like the full-fat version of what 3D Land had offered on handheld. Now, players could race through the Mushroom Kingdom in teams of up to 4. This was the big appeal, something akin to classic Mario that was playable with friends simultaneously for the first time. This made for cooperative, but more importantly competitive chaos, as Nintendo knew all too well how players get when the chance to outperform their friends presents itself. The game's crown mechanic of giving the highest scoring player visible bragging rights drove groups to put more and more time into the game. Super Mario 3D World also gave us the introduction of Captain Toad and his isometric adventures, and Cat Mario, a costume so popular that it showed up in the 2022 Mario movie. With great stages and plenty of content, it was the perfect blend of old and new and one of Mario's greatest outings. 2014 Shovel Knight.
Now, before you start typing those comments down below about how this doesn't belong here, it does belong here because at the beginning I said console exclusives. And most people forget that whilst Shovel Knight debuted on the PC, it also came to the Wii U on the same day, 10 months before anywhere else.
Very rarely do indie games blow up to the point of consideration for overall Game of the Year, but Shovel Knight was such a moorish package. Kicking off a wave of nostalgia indies, what made Shovel Knight so brilliant was that it wasn't ripping off a specific 80s classic wholesale. Instead, it was an amalgamation of several of the games I talked about, 6 years ago at the start of this video and some of their contemporaries. Mega Man, Castlevania, Zelda 2, Ninja Gaiden and Super Mario Bros. 3. This attracted older fans who connected with familiar elements but found something fresh, which was also something that appealed to younger gamers. They might not have the touchstones of the NES games, but certainly recognise the level of challenge and the Dark Soulsian mechanic of dropping currency and having to reclaim it or risk losing it forever. The final parts of this ingenious recipe was wholly unique ideas, such as being able to smash your own checkpoints for treasure at the risk of replaying more of a stage. Whilst many were beginning to stumble on the slippery slope of microtransactions, long installs and bloated open worlds, Shovel Knight was a reminder that video games are supposed to just feel good to play.
And in terms of console players, Wii U owners got to play it first.
2015 Splatoon. You can never tell what Nintendo are going to do with new IP, yet nearly a decade later it's hard to pass if Splatoon was A, a wild surprise, or B, a surprisingly tame addition to Ninty's catalogue, at least from a genre perspective. With dwindling third-party support, the company tried their own spin on a team-based online shooter.
And whilst this made all the sense in the world, I'm not sure anybody had squids that are also kids shooting coloured ink on oil rigs to mark their territory on their bingo card.
However, its zany approach really made Splatoon a feature title of the Wii U. The chaotic team-based fun of fighting for control by painting the scenery more than trying to snipe your foes was delightful. It also made simple but effective use of the gamepad, showing players a top-down map of the arena to see where their presence and ink was needed, as well as allowing them to quickly super jump from place to place with a touch of the screen. One of the best things about Splatoon was that it was a great representation of Nintendo's ability to support a game after release, something that they hadn't really been asked to do a lot of in the past. Like many games, Splatoon only got better with time, tweaks, and more content. 2016 Pokken Tournament.
It was clear early on that the Wii U was going to be a rough generation for the company to turn around, but in 2016, well, it was just a dud across both Nintendo consoles. A bad Paper Mario, a disappointing Star Fox, and a divisive Pokemon generation.
Thank goodness for the anticipated home console release of Pokken Tournament, the fighting game that pit the likes of Mewtwo and Lucario against Pikachu in a mask and a sentient chandelier. Like traditional Pokemon gameplay, Pokken was on the surface a game of rock, paper, scissors, whilst also being deceptively complex. More than just trying to outfox your opponent's choice of attack style, there was making use of the two different phases of battle, a diverse move pool, and a choice of support Pokemon. Battles looked as good as they felt, and it was cool to see classic monsters actually getting into a proper scrap. Whilst Nintendo's slow embrace of online play was where Pokken tended to live best, it was unfortunately lacking content elsewhere. Despite a Switch re-release, Pokken feels all but forgotten, which is a shame because it added something unique to a franchise that is often very sweet and twee.
And that something was beating Pikachu into a fine yellow paste.
2017, The Legend of Zelda Breath of the Wild. The darkest days of the Wii U were finally behind us. A new dawn had begun. In 2017, the Nintendo Switch arrived and put the big N back front and centre. With the console dropping in March, it had plenty of time to bolster its catalogue and make it a must-buy for the Christmas period, with Mario Kart 8 Deluxe, Mario Odyssey, and its industry-shaking Zelda launch title. In many ways, Breath of the Wild was a perfect way to introduce the Switch, as you could play Link's new console adventure at home, and then take take it with you on your own adventure.
To work, to the shops, to a different room. Endless possibilities.
But obviously what made the game truly great was the boldness to just throw out tradition. Zelda's formula had gotten more tired than tired, and Breath of the Wild's laser focus on a feeling of discovery was key. Hyrule was now a wide-open expanse, and players were left to their own devices to conquer its enemies, environments, and secrets. Landmarks and shrines in the horizon drove players forward, and physics-based puzzles made them stop and think. The freedom of not just exploration, but the approach to it would eventually be bettered by the sequel, Tears of the Kingdom, but Breath of the Wild was an event that stopped gaming in its tracks. 2018 Super Smash Bros. Ultimate. When it comes to the most hype video game trailers of all time, few reach the bar that SSBU's reveal hit. With previous games including DLC and often guest characters from non-Nintendo property, there was always the question about whether Nintendo had secured contracts for more than one appearance. As such, when Solid Snake landed, who was missing from the 2014 games, and the trailer announced, "Everyone is here," more heads rolled.
And they continued rolling for the next 3 years as Nintendo released more and more incredible DLC offerings like Minecraft Steve, Kazuya from Tekken, Sora. That one still doesn't seem real.
Super Smash Bros. Ultimate deserves its flowers as a celebration of the medium we love through the eyes of the company that has been through the most. With 89 playable characters, 115 versus stages, over 1,000 pieces of music, Masahiro Sakurai's magnum opus is a museum in game form. It also helps that it's also the most complete version of the gameplay, with fast yet crunchy rewarding feedback and a great escalation from casual party play to something deep and challenging for diehards. With the best campaign of the series on top of it and the spirit system making for an endless stream of unique battle setups, it wasn't shocking that Nintendo said that the game was still one of the Switch's most played 5 years later in 2023. 2019, Fire Emblem Three Houses. Famously, Fire Emblem Awakening was the game that really caused the long-running strategy sim to blow up in the West, and also by extension saved its neck from the chopping block. Ergo, its debut on the Switch needed to maintain that momentum. And Three Houses met expectations by totally refreshing itself for the new age. Swapping out tired mechanics for something much deeper, the stakes of battles are now far greater as each unit has so much more individuality based on how you train them. Training is a part of the monastery, which houses the expanded social side of the game. This allows for greater control of the pace of the experience for both developers and players, who are rewarded for checking in with classmates rather than just bouncing from one battle to the next. This is made all the sweeter by incredible writing and voice performance, which is consistent across its gigantic cast. With 4 possible major story paths and a seemingly endless amount of customization options, Three Houses is one of those perfect Switch games that gets better the more you play. Fire Emblem Awakening lit a fire under the series, and Three Houses cemented it as one of Nintendo's most worthwhile properties, making sure that it's here to stay.
Unless we keep getting games like Engage, then maybe not.
2020 Animal Crossing New Horizons.
There was no more perfect time for a new Animal Crossing game release in a terrible, horrible, no good, very bad year when the world was collectively told to stay home and avoid human contact. Nintendo just so happened to drop their new social simulation game.
The Animal Crossing franchise is as iterative as it gets, with each new game functioning largely the same as the last. And 2020's New Horizons is no different. You shake trees, sell your fruit, buy furniture, and welcome talking animals to your private island whilst paying off a non-negotiable loan with notorious tax dodger Tom Nook. Of course, New Horizons' most complete version of this makes for an endless drip feed of content and events, and enough variety so that when you go online to compare islands with your friends, you're guaranteed to have a good time. The relaxed, cozy pace makes it easy to lose hours every day. We could talk about the importance of games for the industry's health until the anthropomorphic cows come home, but Animal Crossing was crucial in a different way. As a sales juggernaut, especially in Japan, where it nabbed the silver for the country's best-selling game ever, behind the original Pokemon, you almost certainly know, or in fact are, someone who was positively affected by New Horizons' release.
In the face of the terrible, horrible, no good, very bad year, Animal Crossing was the perfect salve. Whimsical, affable, and warm.
2021 Monster Hunter Rise. Whilst Monster Hunter had been low-key kicking ass for years, it wasn't until 2018's World that it truly exploded. The pressure to follow it up was immense, and the excitement among diehards for Monster Hunter returning to Nintendo was palpable.
The Switch had plenty of great games, but it was missing that kind of action game that players could really sink their teeth into. All their axe, or their sword, their bowgun, lances, there's glaives, or
It might seem daunting at first, but when Rise clicks, it does so beautifully. The game has an incredibly gradual difficulty curve, meaning that newcomers to the series won't even notice how far they've come until they look back. It also means it's easier than ever to experiment and find your ideal weapon style, with each one intuitive to pick up and plenty of depth for those who stick with it. Perhaps Rise's biggest improvements come in the form of control and traversal. The Palamute mount makes everything speedy, and the Wire Bug gadget offers verticality and the ability to ride enemy monsters into battle. The Switch's ability to go handheld might make some developers feel as though they should make their games piecemeal and easy to digest in chunks, and whilst Rise is certainly snappy, it has a mind-boggling amount of content and depth. 2022 Xenoblade Chronicles 3. If the Switch is a machine for a single franchise, it's Xenoblade. With the announcement of X coming to the console in 2025, it will mean every single entry is playable in one place. And while Xenoblade has remained consistently well received, the end of the trilogy sees things out with a bang. Across the board, Chronicles 3 represents the pinnacle of Monolith Soft's work. The stylized graphics are gorgeous, its gameplay is constantly evolving, and narratively it manages to smash the worlds of the two previous games together in a satisfying way that rewards long-term fans. Best of all is how these all combine, as the story's themes of freedom and crafting your own future absolutely apply to both the endless possibilities of the battle system and of Xenoblade going its own path. Watching the earnest first entry almost not make its way out of Japan and then pave a way for a series that has become a pillar of the Switch and reach its thus far conclusion is incredibly gratifying. Streamlined combat allows for more overall depth, and a stronger script means darker and more touching moments.
Xenoblade Chronicles 3 is unashamedly a JRPG for fans of the genre. Both huge and meticulous, it rewards players who embed themselves in all that it has to offer.
2023 Super Mario Wonder.
We all take it for granted now, but when it debuted, Mario was weird. Little Plumber Man grows big by eating mushroom he gets from smashing brick with his hand, stomps on turtles, travels through pipe, beats up dinosaur.
But when something becomes franchisable, it's easy for it to be pushed into a box. This is part one of what Super Mario Wonder does so well: change up the formula and surprise long-term players. The other, however, is that most of these inclusions feel so much like they belong that if you were told they've been part of Mario canon since the Super Nintendo, then you probably believe it. The stages across the Flower Kingdom contain a mix of enemies both classic and new in equal measure, and the debuting power-ups like Elephant and Bubble feel so natural. Of course, the central element is the Wonder Flowers, which warp reality around the player in whatever way the stage needs them to. This means that Mario Wonder can repeatedly throw curveballs on a course-by-course basis. One level you'll be riding a line of balls, another might make all the pipes in the stage start moving, another you'll be playing as a Goomba, and it looks gorgeous every second. 2D Mario had been stale for a long time, but Wonder takes it to strange new places, and we thank it for it. And finally, 2024, The Legend of Zelda: Echoes of Wisdom. All told, 2024 wasn't the best year for Nintendo, with the biggest first-party releases mostly being classic titles repackaged to keep the Switch's lights on in its final full year. Still, 2024 was at least a win for princesses, with both Peach and Zelda getting rare leading roles. With the franchise already heavily toying with physics-based tomfoolery, it's no surprise that Echoes of Wisdom does something in the same realm, yet pleasantly different. A sort of pseudo-sequel to the Link's Awakening remake with the same lush toy box charm, Echoes of Wisdom sees Zelda fighting less with sword and bow, and more outthinking her predicaments by cloning parts of her environment. Sick enemies on each other or drop rocks on their head and scale the cliff sides with whatever you can find and reproduce. This, of course, means that the game is completely breakable and unbalanced, with players falling back on a handful of super useful items over the 120 27 available, but in a sense that's the beauty of it. It's your adventure, and you can absolutely fill Hyrule with beds.
Echoes of Wisdom might not be in the upper echelon of the Switch's astounding library, but a game that champions freedom of choice is the perfect way to end an era when Nintendo finally coalesced its home console and handheld markets. Here's to you, Switch, and here's to the Switch too, and here's to you for making it all the way to the end. Have a good week.